After defeating Russia's attempt to take its capital, Ukraine stunned the world again in the summer and fall of 2022, when its armed forces rapidly liberated thousands of square kilometers of territory from the Russian invaders. The twin offensives in the north and south essentially lifted the threat to Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, and freed Kherson from Russian occupation that November. The rapid progress of Ukraine's offensives left the world eagerly anticipating when and where it would strike in 2023, as Russia ground itself to a halt in the struggle for the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk Oblast. The city eventually fell, but Ukraine launched its highly anticipated offensive soon thereafter. The offensive attacked along toward Bakhmut, but the operation in Zaporizhia Oblast was much more important. This offensive aimed to reach the Sea of Azov and cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea. Unfortunately, the 2023 offensive did not prove as effective as 2022's campaign. Ukrainian forces ground forward, but only slowly, as Russian minefields and fortifications proved large obstacles. The much-hoped-for breakthrough from Ukraine and its allies seemed like it would not materialize, and with the muddy season rapidly approaching, the campaign could only be called a modest success. Russia seemed to adapt to Ukraine's successes from 2022. For example, the Russian army put its supply hubs and command and control centers further back from the front line to protect them from HIMARS attacks. This and other adaptations turned the 2023 campaign into one of attrition, which the Russian army was much better suited to. Despite the arrival of Western main battle tanks like the German Leopard and American Abrams, and the use of cluster bombs by the Ukrainians starting in July, no major change to the war's status seemed to occur. Do the Ukrainians have a chance to achieve a breakthrough before the end of the campaigning season? They might. But why, up until recently, has the 2023 campaign been less than stellar so far? And how might Ukraine be able to turn the situation around? Let's take a look at where the Ukrainians were at the start of the offensive, where they are now, and the dangers that still await them. After the Ukrainian successes of 2022, which ended with the recapture of Kherson, winter settled in. The offensive ground to a halt, and Russia used the opportunity to lick its wounds. At the time, most of the world's attention was riveted on Soledar and Bakhmut, which Russia sought to capture at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. Meanwhile, Russia was also building the most extensive and elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since World War I, and arguably the most formidable in the world outside the demilitarized zone across the Korean peninsula. This was especially the case in the Zaporizhia Oblast. This was a vital area to protect, as Ukrainian successes there would cut the Russian army's land bridge to Crimea. That would be a strategic disaster for Russia, as the peninsula is one of its army's most important supply hubs. It would also endanger Vladimir Putin's hold on power, as he promoted the annexation of Crimea in 2014 as one of his greatest achievements. It's hard to see how he would survive losing the war in Ukraine and losing control over Crimea. As early as December 2022, it became apparent that Russia was fortifying the area to protect the access to Crimea. Late that month, Russian forces began to turn the city of Melitopol in Zaporizhia Oblast into a heavily armed fortress. The Russian army concentrated troops in the vicinity and built a network of dragon's teeth covering the entire city, according to Ivan Fedorov, the mayor of the occupied city. Melitopol sits on a major road network in the area and is only about 100 kilometers northeast of Crimea. It was also clear at the end of 2022 that the Russian forces were digging in around the city of Tokmak, another key transit hub in the Zaporizhia Oblast, further north of Melitopol. The Russian army was surrounding the city with a network of trenches and fortifications. As winter settled in over the front and the bulk of the fighting took place around Bakhmut, Russia continued to improve on this network of fortifications. Ukraine's Western allies did not help matters, as they dithered over the delivery of weapons the Ukrainian military had been asking for, such as tanks and longer-range missiles like the American ATACMS. Satellite images taken of the fortifications in Zaporizhia Oblast early in 2023 showed deep lines of trenches, personnel positions, rows of dragon's teeth barriers to impede the movement of tanks, and well-sited artillery placements. By the middle of April 2023, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense reported that the Russians had completed a defense in depth of 3 layers, covering approximately 120 kilometers in length. The first layer was a front line of forward combat positions to weaken an initial Ukrainian attack. The second and third lines of defense were more elaborate and came about 10 to 20 kilometers behind the preceding lines. The fortifications were likely the responsibility of the Russian Southern Grouping of Forces, SGF. As Russia became convinced that an offensive toward Melitopol was coming, it fortified the entire axis of attack to that city. The UK MOD said on April 12th that these fortifications could prove a significant obstacle, but their utility depended on whether the SGF could support them with sufficient manpower and artillery, and it was not sure if it had the capacity to muster such resources. In total, war watchers had described a vast defensive network stretching from Melitopol, with defensive lines encircling Tokmak and the city of Vasilivka, and eastward onward to Poloy by the middle of April 2023. The Zaporizhzhia defenses also include minefields in front of and between the main lines, and anti-tank ditches that require engineering equipment to plug. The fortifications in Zaporizhzhia came a few kilometers behind the front lines and were interlinked with a network stretching through the entire Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine. The Russian forces were also heavily fortifying northern Crimea. This would seem odd because Crimea is well behind the front lines, but for the Russians, there can be no risk of losing the peninsula, and they will protect it in almost any way they can. Western observers hoped the Ukrainians would be able to succeed in the coming offensive by using the tanks they were now receiving to exploit breakthroughs and open gaps for further attacks. However, the delay in the arrival of these tanks would not help this plan. Ukraine needed to wait for a sufficient number of its new assets to arrive, as crews trained on several different tank models. This delay gave the Russians time to dig in even deeper. The first line of defense eventually became the strongest of the three. Ukraine's offensive in Zaporizhzhia Oblast finally began in early June, later than many analysts had expected. As the world's attention was fixed on the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River days earlier, Ukrainian forces attacked south of the town of Orikhiv, toward occupied Tokmak in the western part of the oblast. However, it became clear early on that the offensive was going slower than expected. President Zelensky acknowledged this at the time, but insisted that he would not cut corners and play with the lives of his country's troops. By the end of August, Ukraine had liberated the village of Robotyne, which is approximately 15 kilometers south of Orikhiv and 23 kilometers north of Tokmak. This was a sign of the attritional nature of the campaign. Ukrainian forces were making stunning advances a year earlier, but now they were grinding south very slowly, over months, and Russian minefields, artillery, anti-tank obstacles, and even tunnels were making the Ukrainian troops pay dearly for the land that they took. Russian helicopters had also been active, providing the ground forces with the close air support they had often lacked before that point. The Russians counterattacked at Robotyne on September 6th, but were beaten back. As of late October, Tokmak has still not been taken, much less Melitopol. While the Zaporizhzhia offensive got the most attention because it was the most important, Ukraine was active in other sectors as well. It conducted counterattacks around the captured city of Bakhmut, staged some operations around the Kherson front where it even managed to establish a beachhead on the opposite side of the Dnipro, and applied pressure throughout the entire front line, using infantry companies to attack in constant low-level sorties. Ukraine's Western allies were not entirely pleased with this strategy and pressured the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces on one or two centers of advance. However, for the Ukrainians, this play has had a few advantages. First, it pins down other Russian forces and prevents them from reinforcing the sectors that Ukraine is most interested in. Russia has been mostly on the defensive since the capture of Bakhmut in May, and has only recently begun offensive operations in Avdiivka in Donetsk Oblast. But Russian military bloggers are divided on the success of this attack, and they have complained that the Ukrainian drones have made armored assaults costly. Meanwhile, Ukrainian minefields are obstructing further advances in the area, a reality that has shades of the difficulties Ukraine has faced in the Zaporizhzhia offensive. Ukrainian sources have stated that Russia continues to transfer forces to the Avdiivka sector, indicating that its attacks may not yet be over. Overall, Ukraine's strategy to pin the Russian forces down all across the front while it continues its assault into Zaporizhzhia might be finally paying off. Despite the overall disappointment in the offensive, Ukraine achieved something important at the end of September. It had broken through the Surovikin Line, named after the general who was its architect. The Surovikin Line is the first and strongest of the Russian defensive lines in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. But how did Ukraine manage this breakthrough after many months of seemingly grinding forward with no result? It learned from its bitter experience in the early days of the counteroffensive. For example, Ukraine stopped using artillery to directly support its infantry assaults, That wasn't exactly good news for those units, since the lack of fire support to pin enemy defenders down would have made them much more vulnerable. There was a catch though. Ukraine waited for Russian artillery to shoot first. Then it used its Western-supplied counter-battery radars to fire back, enacting precision strikes on the Russian artillery positions and destroying their guns. The Ukrainians proved so effective at this that related complaints quickly spread around Russian social media sites. The loss of fire support made the Russian units, even those well dug in, vulnerable. After breaching the Surovikin line, Ukraine did not continue to advance to the south directly and ran straight into the teeth of the second line of defense. Instead, Ukrainian units turned to the east and struck around the village of Verbov. The presence of Ukrainian troops in the area confirmed that they had indeed achieved the breakthrough of the first line. From there, Ukrainian troops attacked the second defensive line in a place the Russians did not expect. On September 22nd, the Ukrainians broke into the city. Later, geolocated footage confirmed that Ukrainian troops were operating behind Russia's second defensive line in the Zaporizhia Oblast. However, about a month later, there is no news that the village has been recaptured from the Russians. Still, it is the most rapid progress made since the start of the Zaporizhia campaign. As of October 24th, Ukraine was also making advances toward the villages of Kopani and Novoprokopivka. Russian military bloggers claim that counterattacks are taking place near Verbov and Robotyne, but the situation is muggy, which is actually good news for Ukraine. That information is rapidly changing amid a confused picture indicates that the action in Zaporizhia is fluid and that operations are no longer static assaults against heavily fortified Russian positions. One has been confirmed. Ukrainian forces have gotten behind a regiment's worth of some of Russia's most elite paratroopers, the VDV Airborne Forces. These troops were called in from the north of Ukraine to reinforce the fortifications in Zaporizhia. Again, this is good news for Ukraine because it indicates that Russia is worried that its defenses will crack. There are fears among Russian military bloggers that this elite unit will be encircled and destroyed by Ukrainian forces in the area. Are these units being sacrificed to slow the Ukrainian advance as winter rapidly approaches? That would not be out of the question. The VDV units have suffered heavy casualties since the start of the invasion, as the Russian military has often used these units improperly. According to the commander of this force, Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, at least 8,500 of these paratroopers have been wounded in action since the war began, and a few days later, the UK Ministry of Defence assessed that at least half of the 30,000 paratroopers dispatched to Ukraine had become casualties. These casualties have since been replaced by troops that are far from elite in character. Now these paratroopers are airborne in name only, as they have been intermingled with regular motorized rifle brigades to defend the line in Zaporizhia. Meanwhile, Ukraine has several armored brigades equipped with the Western main battle tanks it received early in the year, waiting in reserve in the area, poised to exploit a breakthrough. If these tanks can widen the gaps the infantry opens for them, the Russian forces manning the defenses in Zaporizhia may find themselves encircled. If such a thing were to occur, the road to Tokmak would be open. If Tokmak falls, the Russian land bridge to Crimea would be in serious danger, as it is an important logistics hub in the area. It would be an excellent staging point for a Ukrainian advance to the Sea of Azov, which, if completed, would split the Russian forces occupying Ukraine in two and trap a sizable amount of Russia's total military power in a giant pocket between Crimea, the eastern part of Kherson Oblast, and the Ukrainian front lines in Zaporizhia. The success of such an operation would open Crimea itself to a siege in the coming campaign. Ukraine has anticipated a Russian retreat to Crimea. That is why it's launched precision strikes against key targets there, like military bases, landing ships, and even submarines. One of the targets was the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol, which was once thought to have killed the fleet's commander, although that particular claim was subsequently debunked. Ukraine has also carried out special operations against Russia's S-400 air defense systems stationed in Crimea, which resulted in Russia losing 3 out of 5 batteries there. The attacks in Crimea have even further eroded the combat effectiveness of the Black Sea Fleet, which had launched frequent missile strikes into Ukraine despite being docked for most of the war. With that becoming less of an option, Russia may need to use its air force much more than it has to make up for the shortfall in firepower. With F-16s armed with long-range air-to-air missiles soon set to arrive in Ukraine, that is not an exciting prospect for Russia either. There's also grim news for Russia on the ground. After many months of wavering, the Biden administration finally approved Ukraine's request for ATACMS missiles as the summer ended. These ground-based ballistic missiles have a range of 300 kilometers, and their arrival has now put all of Russia's bases in Ukrainian territory within range of HIMARS. Ukraine demonstrated Russia's new danger when it fired its ATACMS missiles, which were armed with cluster munitions, for the first time on October 17th. The attacks, which came in the cities of Berdyansk and Luhansk, targeted Russian airfields. In addition to the heavy damage to the infrastructure, the ATACMS missiles and their set of 1,000 separate submunitions destroyed up to 21 enemy helicopters. It was the biggest blow to the Russian Air Force in the war. Meanwhile, dozens of Russian troops were killed or wounded in the operation. This was the result of using just 3 ATACMS missiles. The attack clearly struck a nerve with Putin. When speaking to reporters in Beijing amidst his attendance of China's Belt and Road Forum on October 18th, Putin singled out ATACMS in particular. If Russia has lost the war, why do they, the United States, supply ATACMS? Let's take them back and all the other weapons. Biden can take a seat and eat pancakes and visit us for some tea. If the war is lost, what are we talking about? Why ATACMS? Ask him that. It's funny. Firstly, this of course causes harm and creates an additional threat. Secondly, we will of course be able to repel these attacks. War is war, and of course they pose a threat, that goes without saying. But most importantly, this will not change the situation of the line of contact dramatically at all. It just prolongs the agony. Some commentators found this quotation interesting, as they believe it was the first time Putin referred to his so-called special military operation in Ukraine as a war. But the Russian dictator was quoting Biden for that part of the message. What is more important was Putin's defensiveness about the ATACMS missiles. He knows the threat that they pose to his army in Ukraine, and their arrival means the options are narrowing. With the arrival of ATACMS and F-16s, Ukraine now has almost all of the weapons it requested since the start of the war. The traditional campaigning season may be drawing to a close, but Ukraine is also making plans to continue its offensive into the winter months, learning the lessons from last year. So although the attack through Zaporizhia in the summer and into the fall was far slower than many hoped for, Ukraine now has the momentum and the tools to effect the much-desired breakthrough if it handles its operations properly. For Ukraine, the biggest danger is now not military in nature, but political. The slow pace of the Zaporizhia offensive has emboldened the critics of aid to Ukraine, especially in the United States, which has just been through a period of congressional chaos where rogue members of the narrow Republican majority voted to oust their own speaker. As a result, the US House of Representatives could not do its business for 3 weeks. Aid to Ukraine has been a topic of heated division within the Republican Party's ranks, and the United States is about to enter a presidential election, where assistance to Kyiv will be a notable issue. Joe Biden is unpopular at home, and it's unknown what the Republican nominee's position on the issue will be. If Ukraine seeks to avoid the loss of the American support it needs to win the war, it must continue to demonstrate the capability of making serious gains on the battlefield. Its performance on the battlefield in the coming months could prove decisive to its viability. Its military capability is there, but will the United States commit to it for the long term? All eyes will be watching how the results on the battlefields of Ukraine interact with America's chaotic partisan politics of 2024. But what do you think? Is Ukraine close to a breakthrough in the Zaporizhia Oblast? Will it soon cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea? How will domestic American politics affect the coming year in the war? Be sure to let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Is Ukraine slowly cooking up a pot of Putin's ultimate defeat? There's a popular metaphor which compares a frog to a leader or an organization. As the story goes, if a frog is thrown into a pot of boiling water, it will immediately sense danger and leap to safety. However, throw the same frog in a pot of lukewarm water and increase the temperature 1 degree at a time, and it won't sense danger until it's too late. The meaning is clear. Unless individuals and organizations exercise constant vigilance and adapt to changing circumstances, they can lead themselves into a proverbial pot of hot water, irreversible danger with terrifying consequences. Some experts believe this metaphor applies equally to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Last year, after easily overrunning cities like Kharkiv and Kherson, Putin's forces perhaps thought it would be easy to continue the offensive and consolidate their gains. Their failure to topple Zelensky's regime and serious and recurring logistical problems opened a window of opportunity for Ukraine to seize the initiative. This they did, gradually applying offensive pressure on all fronts. And here is where they began to increase the operational tempo, feinting one way, then boldly attacking another until the operational waters reached their boiling point. Russian troops quickly discovered their positions were untenable. They weren't prepared for the breakthrough in Kharkiv or the more measured collapse of their hold on Kherson until it was too late. Like a frog unable to perceive the slowly but steadily rising temperatures of the water it found itself immersed in, Putin's strategy to wait and see, founded during those dual debacles, in sore need of new conscripts, the frontline troops he did have were effectively boiled in the crucible of war, some proverbially, others, well, literally. Their positions were impossible to sustain, and consequently, they were left with little recourse but to withdraw. Now that the war's front lines have by and large stagnated, some say Ukraine is subtly attempting to bring the water to a boil in other strategic areas. While most observers freely admit Ukraine's 2023 counter-offensive has fallen short of its intended objectives, could a boil the frog strategy still be in play in places like, say, Crimea? Join us today as we explore this issue. Military organizations, more than perhaps any other, are incentivized to adapt to the changing conditions. Their very survival depends on it. Even those as demonstrably inept as Russia's have shown, from time to time, some measured capacity for adaptability over the past year. Putin's forces seem to have wised up after their embarrassing setbacks at Kharkiv and Kherson. Ukraine's relatively unknown offensive capabilities were put on full display, and as Russia's own offensive might have culminated in a series of multi-pronged yet misguided ventures, it opted to consolidate and defend the cities it had captured rather than extend its neck deeper into the Ukrainian vice. This resulted in the strategic decision to sit back and create a defensive network it could viably hold in the event of the anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive. And to their credit, the defensive networks they constructed were said to rival some of those found during World War I, more than a century prior. But Russia has not forsaken offensive operations altogether. More recently, we've watched as Russia has started the slow transition from defensive to offensive operations of their own, a half year after their somewhat Pyrrhic victory at Bakhmut in May 2023. Looking back on that attritional struggle, it's strange to contemplate why Russia placed so much strategic value on a city as devastated as it was. In the end, entirely bereft of infrastructure, resources, and political influence. Sure, Prigozhin got his day in the sun, but like Icarus, perhaps in the end, he flew too close. In some sense, the immense bloodletting in Bakhmut played into Ukrainian hands. While they prepared their forces to strike on the southern axis, they opted to remain on the defensive for much of the Bakhmut battle. Letting Putin press more and more forces into the crucible there deprived him of stronger defenses elsewhere. Like hanging a carrot in front of a donkey, the Ukrainians gambled away Bakhmut in the hope Putin's wagon, firmly tied onto a strategically bankrupt position, would spread Russian troops across a wider frontage and thus create the conditions for success elsewhere. It was a decision in line with the past successes, a bait-and-switch not unlike the priming operations preceding the Kharkiv and Kherson victories. We now know this gamble didn't entirely pay off. Penetrating prepared defenses without air superiority is inarguably the most difficult operation Ukraine could have undertaken, barring, say, a full-blown amphibious assault across the Dnipro River. Yet, mounting domestic and international pressure gave the AFU little other option but to go for it, and their counter-offensive, inching forward yard by yard, has suffered, though not failed, in the bitter cauldron awaiting them. Russia might be able to relate now that they've had a chance to both hold on to Bakhmut and stage new offensives of their own in Avdiivka of late. Avdiivka comparatively holds far more significance than Bakhmut, owing to its proximity to Donetsk. For more than a month, Russia went pedal to the metal there, committing something like 8 brigades, with complements of armor, trucks, and mechanized vehicles, and sustained some of the heaviest casualties of the year, according to British intelligence agencies. When you consider how many Russians were killed in Bakhmut and Vuhledar earlier this year, that observation is startling. When you consider how far they actually managed to get in Avdiivka, that is to say, not far at all, it becomes even more significant. Like it has from the beginning, personnel issues have been Russia's Achilles heel, not necessarily in quantity, where there seems to be an endless stream of contract soldiers and conscripts being flung into battle, but in quality. According to one Russian blogger, an expert on operations in the Donbass, who writes under the pseudonym Wayne Howell, the recent recruitment of contract soldiers from underprivileged social groups pales in comparison to the caliber of professionals and enthusiasts enlisted at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Howell cites several startling anecdotes to illustrate just how stark the golf inequality has become over the past 2 years. There is excessive drinking among new recruits, something he claims regularly leads to their deaths and serious injuries. Examples include fatal instances where a Ural off-road vehicle was driven off a cliff, a soldier fell from a tank and was crushed beneath the tracks of an infantry fighting vehicle, or a recruit sustained a severed arm while playing with an RPG. Rampant alcoholism and an endemic lack of discipline have forced Russian officers into dire straits to maintain order and control. Many, according to Howell, resort to physical punishment, violence, and threats of execution. There are other metrics of quality available to intelligence analysts. You have, for example, men like Nikolai Ogolobyak, a convicted Satanist involved in ritual murders of 4 teenagers in 2010, who was pardoned after only 6 months on the front line. Another recruit, Denis Gorin, who was serving a light 22-year sentence for, I kid you not, murder and cannibalism, was recently wounded and will more than likely be released upon recovery. No wonder we see Russian soldiers regularly abandon wounded comrades in arms in their time of need. All of this comes, predictably, with a severe downtick in motivation, which, in turn, results in a marked inability to achieve noticeable results on the front line. We've seen a return to Wagner tactics, recruit the worst of the worst, amalgamate them into Storm Z units, and throw them in waves at the nearest hellhole. This lack of professionalism, Howell and other experts claim, is what's preventing Russian forces from eliminating the Ukrainian foothold on the Kherson axis. Despite continuous airstrikes for 2 weeks and the deployment of additional naval infantry units, Ukraine continues to creep toward the M14 Belt Highway, a lifeline of Russian supply to Novokakhovka. If they cut it off, the Russian situation there may grow even more untenable. The water temperature is rising, degree by degree. But back in Avdiivka, you might say, Russians did manage to enter the industrial zone, didn't they? Yes, but only at the cost of a third wave of assaults, resulting in significant military losses without yielding substantial gains. So here we are. Russia is raging against the machine, wading through minefields and mud. The offensive potential of the AFU is likewise mostly depleted, and it has real resource constraints to deal with over the winter. The tempo of frontline operations has slowed dramatically. Advances are now measured in hundreds of meters at best, and contested territories regularly change hands. Most fighting occurs at the platoon and assault group level, involving only a few soldiers rather than entire battalions. Soldiers mostly remain in trenches, and according to one commentator, achieving any substantial gains with such small groups of men is virtually impossible. Where does that leave Russia? They will continue to try and encircle Avdiivka, but with the shadow of Bakhmut looming over the battlefield, there is no guarantee even if they capture it, they'll be able to hold it. As at Bakhmut, Ukraine will not go gently into that good night. They will thrash and flail and rail and defend with all their might, and likely, in the process, not only inflict thousands more Russian casualties, but keep them tidily localized in the east. Where does that leave Ukraine? Truthfully, a prolonged defense of Avdiivka counterintuitively works in their favor if their ultimate military strategy remains focused on someday recapturing Crimea. The only way they can actually achieve this is if they manage to isolate and cut the land bridge it enjoys with Russia. According to Ed Arnold, a research fellow at Britain's Royal United Services Institute and ex-infantry officer, Ukraine now knows how Russia fights and have learned how to manage Russian offensive operations and mitigate their threat while undergoing the requisite period of regeneration. Notably, Arnold believes it's premature to claim Ukraine's counteroffensive has both come to an end or resulted in failure. One of the issues, he said in an interview, is that we try to measure success on the expectations which are far too high anyway. Actually, it's less about the whole territory that's been liberated over the last 5 months, and it's more about where it is. They are pressing towards Tokmak, a crossroads on the road to the Sea of Azov. They are making limited river crossings over the Dnipro River, straining the Russian flank. And so, if they continue edging towards this critical overland supply passage while Russia commits massive formations in places like Avdiivka, you introduce the possibility of isolating Crimea. Russia will be forced to fill gaps rather than having time to reconstitute defensive lines. And when you factor in what's been going on in the Black Sea, operations integral to Ukraine's military strategy, but whose impact is rarely visible on the map, where persistent drone attacks have forced Russian ships to virtually leave Sevastopol and stage further afield from the battlefield, What the UK Defence Minister recently labelled the functional defeat of the Black Sea Fleet has made the pot just another degree hotter for the Russian frog. In the long run, we may look back on the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive in far different terms than many commentators are bandying about today. Not a disappointing anticlimax, but a vital preparatory phase to the very difficult task before them in 2024. In Ukraine's boiling the frog strategy, the jewel is Crimea. It is Putin's darling. But rather than assaulting it militarily, which would more than likely result in an unthinkable military disaster, Ukraine may be able to incrementally increase pressure by layering its ongoing operations, full-front engagement, intelligence penetration, partisan warfare, drone attacks, depriving the Black Sea Fleet any room for maneuver, the occasional drone strike on Russia itself. These all limit options Putin enjoys, and eventually could make it simply untenable to retain its hold on Crimea, similar to the way Russia's presence in Afghanistan eventually became untenable. Ukraine's access to Western munitions and materiel will weigh heavily in the final outcome of this struggle. The provision of long-range missile systems like the ATACMS have already proven to be devastatingly effective. For several weeks, a spate of reports revealed a series of highly destructive strikes carried out against Russian targets, forcing Putin's senior military officials to wrestle with the question of balancing the need to withdraw certain priority targets beyond the reach of ATACMS missiles, while continuing to provide the necessary support for forces engaged in bitter fighting along the front lines of the war. Unlike weapon systems like the Paladin, HIMARS, cluster munitions, or the F-16 M1 Abrams or M2 Bradley, ATACMS were sent to Ukraine without much fanfare or announcement. Ukraine benefited from this decision, using the element of surprise to mount overnight attacks on Russian air bases in mid-October 2023 to devastating effect. Russia now knows the impact of these missile systems. Ukraine knows it must continue to nurture its pipeline of long-range munitions for the short and distant future. Underpinning it all is the outsized impact of these extended-range weapons in Ukrainian hands. It affects the immediate tactical calculus of Russian officers who, left with no real answer, had to virtually push their highest-value targets further and further back from the front lines, under the threat of HIMARS, and now even further with ATACMS. Strategically, Ukraine will have to make a conscious decision to expend its precious supply of these munitions throughout the winter in order to degrade logistics hubs, trench-digging equipment, ammunition dumps, and command and control nodes that will be vital in defending the path to Crimea. There is an even longer range and more persistent threat Russia must contend with: partisan warfare and special operations in Russian-controlled territory. Ukraine's intelligence network is incredibly capable and has a deep bench of contacts both within and without the Russian Federation. These networks have occasionally made their presence known throughout the conflict: targeted assassinations of pro-Russian occupation officials, car bombings, drone strikes, and cross-border incursions into Russia itself, and even recent reports of Ukrainian special forces units masterminding drone strikes on Wagner PMC units operating in Sudan. These attacks send a clear message: Ukraine can strike anywhere, everywhere, and without prejudice if it has to. It's another part of the layered approach at the heart of Ukraine's boil the frog strategy, another gradually compounding factor which will make holding areas like Crimea more and more difficult as time goes by. Eventually, Putin will be left with two choices: withdraw from eastern Ukraine and eventually Crimea itself, a very unlikely outcome, or reinforce his present positions even more than he already has. Crimea's vulnerabilities are well known to the Ukrainians. They are just waiting for the right opportunity and delivery system to put another munition on the Kerch Bridge, mounting the pressure to force Putin to reinforce the region at the expense of other fronts. This is why the Tokmak axis was Ukraine's major axis of attack. Control the railways there, and you can virtually control the movements in and out of Crimea. In this case, it's not even vital that they reach the Sea of Azov itself for this strategy to achieve its intended effect. It just has to imperil Russia's lateral lines of communication to the extent that its position in southeastern Ukraine becomes untenable and leaves Crimea more vulnerable to layered attacks. If Putin is indeed playing the long game, there's a lot he'll have to consider. Yes, Russia has far more territory than it did in 2014, but holding on to that territory so ineffectively in a way that has fully telegraphed its true military potential to the entire world has come at a high cost. Everyone, Russia included, knows it will not be able to stage amphibious offensive operations on the scale it did in 2022, again for several years minimum. Blunted in Bakhmut, bloodied in Avdiivka. If Russia continues to harbor the frankly insane offensive ambitions that it has in 2023, it will only become more and more difficult to hold on to territory it has gained. There have been intonations in certain Russian camps that several senior officials favor some sort of ceasefire. As conditions have stalemated, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has also called for a ceasefire, though his opinion isn't worth much in Kremlin circles. Recently, he pointed out how there are enough problems on both sides, and in general, the situation is now seriously stalemated. No one can do anything to substantively strengthen or advance their position. Notably, this was actually the first time he'd stepped out and sought a truce to end the conflict. Zelensky has put forward a 10-point plan, and there have, to date, been 3 rounds of peace talks with both sides and representatives from across the globe, putting out feelers as to the feasibility of making it work in theory. In practice, Zelensky has shown zero indications he believes Russia will legitimately adhere to any form of peace accords they agree on. The Russian Federation has no international legitimacy in keeping its word. Until they change, the fighting continues. Both leaders are watching the outcome of the looming US presidential election with a sense of uncertain foreboding. On its outcome rests the future of American material assistance to Ukraine, the posture of the West's foremost member toward Russia as a member of the liberal international order, and if Trump is re-elected, perhaps Putin's best chance of reaching terms amenable to him while holding onto territory he has captured. Noted British historian and Russian expert Mark Galeotti has recently claimed that for both sides, Crimea will serve as the major bargaining chip on the peace table. From before 2014, everything, including the Russian occupation of Luhansk and Donetsk, has evolved around Crimea. Putin has stated unequivocally that Crimea is a major red line and that any immediate threat to it will result in a major escalation. Figuring out how to threaten Crimea in the most effective manner possible will continue to occupy Ukrainian military planners. Geographically, it is a formidable target, rimmed by the sea, marshy and difficult to traverse in the north, and relatively narrow in terms of land frontage. For an amphibious assault in the south, all virtually make direct assaults out of the question. That leaves the boil the frog strategy. Gradual pressure on many fronts not only isolates the region, but removes the immediate escalatory potential of Putin's imaginary red line. Ukraine will likely also have to figure out how to bring synergistic systems like the ATACMS, F-16s, and its surviving Western armor to bear. What is reassuring is that Ukraine's layered approach has had a tangible impact on Russia's operational outlay. It has had to bring so many of its vaunted S-400 air defense systems forward to protect high-value targets that it has left Moscow and many parts of Russia almost entirely deprived of air defenses of their own. Scarcity, both of military systems and equipment, is evident on every hand. Political pressure is also mounting, far more demonstrably in 2023 than it was in 2022. Ukraine enjoys the same advantages of other underdogs throughout history. That is, for the foreseeable future, it doesn't have to necessarily deliver a war-winning blow or destroy the entirety of the Russian armed forces on the battlefield. It just has to not lose. Many will try to tell you the conditions are the same for Russia, but don't be fooled. It was the invader, it remains the occupier. Much like the pottery barn analogy thrown about in the wake of the United States' 2003 invasion of Iraq, you break it, you buy it. The history of military interventions in hostile territory bear witness to the fact an invader must balance economic support, industrial production, political vitality, and military initiative regardless of the extent of enemy resistance. In each of these, Russia is increasingly found wanting. More importantly, at the strategic level, the corollary to not losing for Ukraine is to continue doing what it's already doing, raising the temperature of the proverbial pot of water 1 degree at a time until the Russian frog is boiled. But what do you think? Will Ukraine's tactic be successful, or will Putin once again find a way to wiggle his way out of a sticky situation? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. After repeatedly asking the US for a few of their MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS for short, Ukrainian forces will finally be getting this long-awaited upgrade to their arsenal. In September, military officials in Washington confirmed they will be sending as many ATACMS over the coming weeks as the US could reasonably spare. And as of mid-October, these high-tech surface-to-surface artillery weapons have been making an impact. But how? In what way? Why are these missiles so crucial for Ukraine compared to other weapons? Let's find out. While offering a special thanks to his friends at the White House recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky added that the missiles have more than proven themselves during a pair of synchronized nighttime attacks. Zelensky said that the ATACMs were used against two military airfields, one in Berdyansk and the other in the Luhansk region, a dual strike that resulted in significant losses on the Russian side, including 9 military helicopters, an anti-aircraft missile battery, and an ammunition storage depot. Bolstered by their recent upgrade from Washington, Ukrainian officials have stated plainly that with these new weapons at hand, there will be nowhere left for Russian troops to hide within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. This pair of attacks was executed shortly after Russia launched a surprise attack on the town of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. Encompassing 3 battalions comprised of some 2,000 troops, along with dozens of armored vehicles and a handful of jets providing air support, this would turn out to be the largest assault carried out in this area so far. But this was only the latest flare-up of the ongoing contest for the much-contested municipality of Avdiivka, considered by both sides to be the gateway to the city of Donetsk, the capital of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. Avdiivka not only has significant strategic importance, but the town has been the stage for many frontline battles since Moscow annexed Crimea 9 years ago, essentially triggering the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Since then, the town has been heavily fortified, making it extremely difficult for Russian troops to establish a foothold there. This has also turned the town, which had a pre-war population of nearly 32,000, but is now down to around 1,600 residents, mostly living in basements and other sub-ground dwellings, into a symbol of the Ukrainian people's unflinching resistance. Ukrainian defensive positions in Avdiivka have allowed its forces to resist repeated Russian attacks, at least for now. At this point, losing this territory would be a tough blow for Ukraine, both strategically and in terms of morale, especially after this summer's highly anticipated counteroffensive resulted in only marginal gains. So why is Biden giving ATACMs to Ukraine such a big deal? Well, for one, Ukrainian forces have so far been able to fend off dozens of attacks, so it will certainly be interesting to see how the arrival of ATACMs missiles on the battlefield shifts the advantage. And for two, the ATACMs will undoubtedly play a crucial role on the battlefield, as Kyiv continues to ramp up its assaults on Russian-occupied areas of Crimea. Recently, Ukrainian forces have expanded their attempts to undermine Russian forces, including the launch of a devastating attack on a Russian naval base in Sevastopol back in September that damaged a ship and a submarine and injured 24 people. And more recently, there was the destruction of the 2 Russian landing crafts by Ukrainian sea drones, an overnight operation that was part of a series of escalating strikes on the peninsula. Ukraine insists that the strikes on Crimea, which have mostly targeted Russian naval bases and vessels, are a critical element of their overall counteroffensive strategy. Ultimately, they want to make it impossible for Russia to continue its assault on the Ukrainian mainland, and in the process, Kyiv is hoping to land a few strategic and symbolic blows against Russian forces, which the ATACMs should certainly help with, as focus shifts back toward Crimea. The escalation of attacks across Crimea began after Russia allowed the Black Sea Grain Initiative to lapse this past July, a globally crucial deal that has allowed Ukraine to export grain by sea. Previously, foreign container ships were allowed to bypass Russia's blockade and navigate safely to Turkey's Bosphorus Strait, then onto global markets. Ukraine's uninterrupted export of grain is vital for stabilizing global food prices and bringing relief to many developing countries. The impact this war, and certainly the collapse of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, has had on global food markets has been disastrous, especially given that Ukraine is a major supplier of food to the World Food Programme, WFP, an international organization within the UN that provides food assistance across the globe. At a glance, Ukraine's contribution makes up 10% of the global wheat market, 15% of the corn market, and 13% of the barley market. It's also a key player in the world's sunflower oil market. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, another organization within the UN, as many as 47 million people could face serious problems in terms of food insecurity as a result of this war. And now, with Russia's Black Sea Fleet resuming its blockade of Ukraine's ports, vital grain exports are being prevented, creating a direct threat to global food security.
what Zelensky has simply called another attempt by Russia to weaponize hunger and destabilize the global food market. This situation has left Ukraine eager to secure its position in Crimea, which has meant, along with their missiles and drone strikes, a stepping up of their clandestine operations as well. Recently, in the occupied city of Luhansk, a car explosion killed pro-Moscow former head of police, Mikhail Filipenko. Representatives of Ukraine's defense intelligence have claimed responsibility for the apparent assassination, saying it was a joint operation carried out with pro-Ukrainian partisans, before issuing a warning of retribution to other pro-Russian officials positioned in occupied areas. There was also, quite recently, the bombing of a Russian train outside the city of Ryazan, about 196 kilometers, 122 miles, southeast of Moscow. Placed on a section of track, the improvised explosive device derailed 19 freight cars and caused several injuries. And though Kyiv hasn't officially taken responsibility, that hasn't stopped the Kremlin from making the accusation, citing a series of recent cross-border strikes by Ukrainian forces and their allies. The question seems to be now, other than the success they've already had, how will Kyiv make the most of their new weapon? Ukrainian forces were already familiar with the wheeled M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, a mobile rocket launcher commonly known as the HIMARS, that are used to carry and fire ATACMS. Up until now, though, the US had only been supplying shorter-range guided rockets, fired from a HIMARS mobile launcher, or a tracked M270 multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS. The longest-range variants of the ATACMS can strike targets out to a distance of 300 kilometers, 190 miles. This extension of their reach will more than likely allow Ukrainian forces to launch attacks further into Russian-held territories, including the Crimean Peninsula and other areas bordering the Black Sea. So you might be wondering, besides its impressive range, what's the big deal with ATACMS? Well, to start, most of these 4-meter-long missiles carry a WDU-18 230 kilogram, 500-pound blast fragmentation warhead. They can travel in excess of Mach 3, around 3,700 kilometers, 2,300 miles per hour, and, depending on which variant you choose, they can cost between $820,000 and $1.7 million apiece. The impressive speed of the ATACMS compared to similar cruise missiles, such as the UK's Storm Shadow or Russia's KH-101, has been one of its key selling points, and is due largely to the fact that the ATACMS is, essentially, a ballistic missile with a rocket engine strapped to its back, which makes them very hard to shoot out of the sky. Okay, so if these high-tech precision missiles come with a rocket engine on the back, what comes at the front? When it comes to the payload carried on the ATACMS, you've really got two options. One is a unitary warhead, which is basically what it sounds like, a single explosive charge. The other is a submunition warhead, a container filled with lots of submunitions or bomblets. These are also mostly what they sound like, a bunch of little bombs that can be dispersed over a large target area. In terms of ATACMS, this means hundreds of steel-cased balls filled with incendiary pellets. So which one is better? Well, it largely depends on your intended target. Unitary warheads are better for destroying specific targets, say a stationary tank, ammunition depot, or a large artillery piece, while submunition warheads will be more effective against moving targets, say a convoy of vehicles or an advancing column of troops. Both warhead variations have been designed with specific target categories in mind, but both can be highly effective against a wide variety of individual targets too. The ATACMS platform also comes with a number of variants, though it's not 100% clear which one President Biden ended up passing on to the Ukrainians. The most widely produced variant is the M39 Block 1, which was added to the US's arsenal in 1991. The original design for this variant had a range of 25 to 165 kilometers, 15 to 100 miles, and carried a payload of 950 incendiary bomblets, each about the size of a baseball and weighing around 0.6 kilograms. And when dispersed above a target, these bomblets can cover an area of 33,000 square meters, 360,000 square feet. Although no longer in production, about 1,650 of the M39 Block 1 variants were made, with several hundred of those being used in combat during both Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. All remaining missiles have been modified to carry a unitary fragmentation warhead. But this hasn't been the only variant to be used in combat over the years. With nearly double the range and a GPS-aided guidance system,
The M39A1 variant can reach targets anywhere from 12 to 185 miles, 20 to 300 kilometers away, but carries a somewhat smaller payload of just 300 incendiary bomblets. Entering the US's arsenal in 1997, some 610 of these were produced, with around 74 being used in combat, primarily during Operation Iraqi Freedom. This variation is no longer in production, and all remaining units have also had their cluster munition payloads swapped out for a single warhead. Arriving in 2001, the M48 variant, a quick-reaction unitary missile with a GPS-aided guidance system, carries a single 230-kilogram (500-pound) high-explosive warhead and has a maximum range of 185 miles (300 kilometers). It should be noted that when a fragmentation warhead, like the one found on this variant and many others, explodes, the blast sends thousands of metallic fragments flying in every direction, much like a 360-degree spray of bullets. Between 2001 and 2004, 176 M48s were produced, 16 of which were used during Operation Iraqi Freedom, while another 42 appeared in combat during Operation Enduring Freedom. The remaining missiles are in the possession of the US Army and Marine Corps. Then there's the M57 variant, which is similar in many ways to the M48, mainly in its ability to carry a single high-explosive warhead out to a distance of some 185 miles or 300 kilometers. Going into production directly after the M48 went out, a little over 500 of these were made, but only 33 have been used in combat, reportedly during Operation Enduring Freedom. The M57 is also very accurate, boasting a circular error probability (CEP) of less than 9 meters or 30 feet. Typically expressed as a radius, CEP is an important measurement for assessing the accuracy of guided munitions, such as missiles. CEP and missile accuracy in general can be influenced by a range of factors, including guidance system technology and environmental conditions. So essentially, the smaller the CEP, the more accurate the system is considered to be. Let's say, for example, a missile has a CEP of 20 meters. This means there's a high probability, usually greater than 50%, that the actual point of impact will be within a 20 meters radius of the intended target, which means that an M57 ATACMS missile, fired from, let's say, Brussels, Belgium or Dunkirk, could reliably hit the Eiffel Tower, as well as a range of smaller targets located at the same distances. Which brings us to the last variant we're going to look at, but certainly not the least, the M57A1, which is basically identical to the M57 in terms of general specifications and capabilities, except for one major difference. The warhead found on this variant comes with an adjustable blast height, allowing for a wider dispersion of bomb fragments should the situation call for it. After looking more closely at the ATACMS, we can definitely conclude that it has superior speed, range, versatility, accuracy, and explosive power than any other surface-to-surface missile on the market. Its most notable feature, however, might just be the mobility of the system from which it's launched. Because the ATACMS can be launched from a mobile ground vehicle like the HIMARS, which they're already familiar with, Ukrainian troops can easily shoot and then move over a variety of different terrains. Ukrainian combatants can hide if necessary. They can avoid retaliatory attacks. And most importantly, they can create a sense of uncertainty for the Russians, who won't be able to predict where the next strike might be coming from. In practical terms, this means that a Ukrainian mobile artillery unit traveling in an ATACMS-equipped HIMARS could stop basically anywhere, anytime, and launch a precision attack on a target it would take them perhaps 5 to 6 hours to drive to, if they could reach it by land at all. Clearly, Washington's gift of the ATACMS has opened up a range of strategic options for Ukraine's perpetually outnumbered forces, options that could lead to plenty of scenarios where Ukraine has a significant battlefield advantage. The arrival of the ATACMS could very well allow for easier destruction of Russia's air defense systems, airfields, and other military installations deep within the enemy's territory, as we've already seen Ukraine do when they recently used their new missiles to wipe out a pair of Russian air bases. In the wake of this recent news, many of Ukraine's supporters have been quick to applaud Biden's generosity, but it's also important not to get carried away here. Old Uncle Joe didn't just happily hand over a bunch of his precious ATACMS the first time Zelensky asked for them. The folks in Washington have actually been quite hesitant to do so, and for two pretty good reasons.
One, there's the risk that significantly increasing Kyiv's fighting ability might also increase the tension between the US and Russia. And two, the US also had its own national security needs to consider, as its stockpile of ATACMS, which have been out of production since 2017, has continued to dwindle. The latter issue, however, keeping enough ATACMS on hand to balance its own security needs with those of Ukraine and Europe as a whole, seems to have been mostly resolved by the recent arrival of a suitable replacement. And it is fancy. In March 2016, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies announced they'd be working in tandem to develop a missile that would meet the US Army's replacement requirements. This new missile, if it would indeed end up shouldering out the ATACMS, would need not only advanced propulsion, allowing it to fly faster and farther, it would also need to be thinner and sleeker. For what purpose, you ask? So that the loadout could be increased to 2 per pod, doubling the number of missiles that could be carried by the HIMARS or tracked by the M270 MLRS. Well, the Army ultimately got what they wanted, introducing the Precision Strike Missile, or PrSM for short, which has reportedly left production and will be entering US stockpiles in the near future, if it hasn't already. The PrSM, which would ultimately be developed by Lockheed Martin, is at the leading edge of long-range precision strike missiles. With an equally cool-sounding name compared to the ATACMS, this next-generation surface-to-surface weapon uses enhanced attack capabilities to neutralize, suppress, and destroy targets at a distance of 310+ miles, over 499 kilometers. On top of increased range, lethality, in-flight survivability, and missile loadout, the PrSM also comes with an advanced cluster munition warhead comprised of preformed fragments. While the PrSM development program started out as a competitive effort between Lockheed and Raytheon, Raytheon would end up withdrawing from the competition in early 2020 due to technical issues that delayed their missile's flight test. The original intent of both companies was to reach a maximum range of no more than 499 kilometers, due to restrictions outlined in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by former President Ronald Reagan and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. Among other restrictions, the INF Treaty prevents signatories from developing missiles that can travel 500 kilometers or more, but these limitations went out the window in August 2019, when former President Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the treaty. This decision came after more than a decade of accusations, coming from both the US and Russia, that the other had violated the terms of the treaty. And so, with a brand new long-range precision missile in their arsenal, and who knows what variants on the way, the only thing that will stop Washington from providing ATACMS to Ukraine was Russian President Vladimir Putin's uncertain reaction. In short, he wasn't pleased. So far, Putin has said that the US providing Kyiv with ATACMS was a big mistake, and that the US is wading deeper and deeper into a conflict the Russian leader believes is none of its business. Previously, Putin called the delivery of ATACMS to Ukraine a red line that the US had better not cross. Yet he's also stated that the ATACMS will not make a significant difference on the battlefield, that Russian forces will have no trouble repelling attacks, and this intrusion by the US will only serve to prolong this war and bring more suffering to the people of Ukraine. But this isn't the first time Putin has brought up the subject of long-range missiles. When Russia initially marched more than 100,000 troops to the border of Ukraine, 2 months before they invaded, the Kremlin also sent NATO a list of demands that was structured as more of a one-sided treaty, along with the articles insisting that NATO both shuts its doors to new members and remove all its forces from the 14 countries that joined after the Soviet Union collapsed. One article declares that no land-based missiles be deployed to areas that would allow them to reach any territory belonging to Russia. Technically, the missiles haven't gotten closer, their range has just increased, but still, this was the red line Putin was referring to. But now that it's been crossed, the Russian president doesn't seem overly concerned. This could be because he was expecting it, or because the delivery of the ATACMS, however significant their future impact could be, is only a small part of a much larger delivery from the US, a delivery that's come to exceed $76 billion in humanitarian, financial, and military support, which has been offered to Ukraine by the Biden administration and the US Congress since the war began. While dozens of other countries have also provided large aid packages to Ukraine, including most members of NATO and the European Union, the US has really taken the lead. So far, the US has delivered surveillance and attack drones, coastal defense ships, satellite communications equipment, and advanced surveillance and radar systems.
They've sent over hundreds of Abrams tanks and artillery pieces, thousands of Humvees and other tactical vehicles, tens of thousands of rockets, missiles, and various other munitions, not to mention several types of anti-aircraft missiles, including 12 National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems (NASAMS), and 1 Patriot Air Defense Battery plus munitions. And on top of 35,000 grenade launchers and small arms with ammunition, other extremely helpful but less publicized items the US has sent to Ukraine include night vision and thermal imagery systems, laser rangefinders, C4 explosives, explosive ordnance disposal equipment, M18A1 Claymore mines, cold weather gear, and generators. Breaking down the numbers, around $3.9 billion, or 5% of the total, has gone to humanitarian aid, in the form of emergency food assistance, healthcare, and refugee support, among other resources, while another $26.4 billion, or 34%, has gone to financial and budgetary aid via loans and the Economic Support Fund, an economic assistance fund used to advance the US's political and strategic interests by helping allied countries meet their political, economic, and security needs. And the rest of that $75+ billion, that's all gone directly or indirectly to weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Nearly a quarter of the total, around $18.3 billion, has been allocated for security assistance in the form of training, equipment, weapons, and logistics support provided via the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, a program initiated by the US Department of Defense with the intention of providing help to Ukraine by enhancing its defense capabilities and mitigating certain security challenges, mainly a Russian invasion. Another $23.5 billion worth of weapons and military equipment has come directly from the DoD's personal supply. And still another $4.7 billion has come in the form of grants and loans for weapons and equipment via the Foreign Military Financing Program. Another US initiative, this one providing grants and loans to nations so they can purchase weapons, defense equipment and services, and military training from the US through government-to-government sales. Long before crossing Putin's metaphorical red line with his delivery of ATACMs, Biden also stirred up the hornet's nest, as well as some international controversy, when he agreed to furnish Ukraine with cluster munitions, which most countries have banned due to the increased risk their use poses to civilians by 1. Their lack of precision, and 2. The danger of undetonated ordnance being triggered accidentally later on. Still, a number of analysts in the West have asserted that the assistance offered by the US, as well as its allies, has been crucial in Ukraine's continued defense, and has even created the opportunity to launch a number of critical counteroffensives against Russia. Some analysts, as well as many supporters of Ukraine, also believe the country's failure to expel Russia will result in the subjugation of millions of Ukrainians, while simultaneously fueling Putin's ambitions to recover territory that once belonged to the former Soviet Union, which might also end up encouraging China to pursue or enhance similar aggressive tactics, which means military support for Ukraine will likely continue. To a significant degree, though it has certainly not been alone, the US has led the world in offering security assistance to Ukraine. Their javelins have halted Russian tanks during their savage assault on Kyiv. Their air defense systems have intercepted Russian strikes aimed at Ukrainian infrastructure. The US has also provided financial and humanitarian assistance, which has helped Ukraine maintain highly fundamental services such as healthcare and heat. Many NATO members, including the US and other allied nations, have, too, been cautious about getting directly involved in the conflict, being concerned primarily with Putin's not-so-subtle threats of starting a nuclear war. As we've seen, however, governments across the world have overcome their initial hesitancy and provided Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated assets, including battle tanks, modern fighter aircraft, and now, high-tech, long-range precision missile systems. But what do you think? Has the US crossed a line by sending ATACMs to Ukraine? Should NATO and its allies simply stay out of it? Are we inching closer to a global nuclear conflict instigated by Russia? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia prided itself on its tank force, and many international military experts bought into the Kremlin's hype. Russia had the world's largest tank fleet, at over 12,500 units, and Western experts feared that its newest tank, the T-14 Armata, would prove superior to any of the tanks in NATO's arsenal. Another of the Russian armored vehicles that Western experts feared before the invasion was the scary-sounding BMP-T Terminator. This vehicle was fast, well-armored, and armed to the teeth, and yet when it was deployed to the battlefields of Ukraine, it proved to be of little consequence, unable to change the tempo of the war. While effective, the BMPT Terminator proved far from the terror that the Kremlin said it was. Let's take a look at the history of the BMPT Terminator and how it did not exactly perform as Russia's military bloggers and Putin's regime advertised when it actually went to war. The BMPT Terminator saw its origins in the Chechen Wars of the 1990s. In these urban conflicts, Chechen fighters armed with light anti-tank weapons like RPGs took a terrible toll on Russian armored forces, as troops bearing these arms fired down from rooftops and high-story perches on the thinly protected tops of Russian tanks, destroying them in large numbers. To make matters worse for the Russian armor, it could not retaliate because the turrets on Russia's tanks and armored vehicles, like the BMP, cannot raise their main guns at high angles. They can't lower their guns to low angles either, and Chechen fighters would ambush them from basements too. In response to the poor performance of its armored forces against the Chechens, the Russians designed a new armored vehicle, the BMPT Terminator. While these vehicles are designed to support main battle tanks in urban warfare, they come armed with twin 30mm autocannons capable of firing multiple types of rounds, ranging from hardened armor-piercing rounds to explosive shells. Both autocannons come with a capacity of 850 rounds. To make the Terminator more versatile, it can load different rounds in each of its autocannons, so one gun can fire anti-personnel rounds and another can shoot armor-piercing shells. The autocannons have a range between 2.5 and 4 kilometers depending on the round. The targeting system was originally designed to give gunners the ability to designate one target for one round and another for a different round if need be, but this was found to be confusing and impractical and subsequently discontinued by the Russian brass. It is possible that this capability could be restored with advances in artificial intelligence, but given that this is Russia we're talking about, it's probably best not to bet on that possibility coming to fruition anytime soon. BMPT Terminator tanks can also carry a set of 4 Attack-A-T 130mm guided missiles, 2 in pods on either side of the vehicle's autocannons. These missiles are versatile and can be used in an anti-armor role, a high-explosive building-clearing role, or even to attack some helicopters. Thermobaric versions can also be deployed. The Attack missiles can hit targets up to 6 kilometers away. As a tertiary weapon, the BMPT Terminator has a 7.62mm PTKM machine gun with a capacity of 2,100 rounds. One version of the Terminator also comes armed with 4 AG-17D 30mm grenade launchers with a capacity of up to 600 rounds, which it can fire at a rate of 480 rounds per minute. These grenades have a kill radius of 7 meters and a range of 1.7 kilometers. The vehicle has a crew of 5 men, and there's another version of the Terminator which lacks the grenade launchers and comes with a crew of 3. The BMPT Terminator has separate sights for the commander and gunner, giving it redundancy if one of the sights malfunctions. Laser rangefinders and computerized fire control systems support these sights. These systems are designed to operate in conjunction with the vehicle's high speed of 60 kilometers per hour while it's cruising. Defensively, the BMPT Terminator is shielded by explosive reactive armor. This is armor that disrupts anti-tank weapons by exploding outwards when a projectile makes contact with it, preventing the worst from happening to the vehicle. The Terminator has metal grills on its sides and back also, which can reduce the penetration power of some anti-armor weapons. The vehicle also has 6 smoke grenades on each side of the turret and a screening system that warns the crew if their vehicle is being subjected to laser tracking. The Terminator's crew can raise the vehicle's gun turret to 45 degrees, allowing them to fire at threats from above. The turret can also move downward to -5 degrees, making the vehicle effective at attacking targets from below or directly in front of it. The turret can also spin 360 degrees. This maneuverability makes the BMPT Terminator far less vulnerable than other Russian tanks and armored vehicles. This one can actually retaliate if troops fire on it from rooftops. The vehicle weighs about 53 tons and has a cruising range of 500 kilometers. Its engine is nearly 1,000 horsepower and it's maneuverable. The Terminator can traverse ditches between 2.6 and 2.8 meters wide. It can also dive into 1.2 meters of water, which can increase to 1.8 meters if it uses a snorkel. The BMPT Terminator is manufactured by Uralvagenzavod, the company based in Nizhny Tagil in Sverdlovsk Oblast, which manufactures many of Russia's other tanks and armored vehicles. Future plans for the BMPT Terminator include the possibility of it becoming fully robotic. The Terminator's existence reflects Russian doctrine about warfare. Western countries learned from urban fighting in Iraq about just how important it is to integrate infantry and armored units effectively. In these counterinsurgency operations, infantry would dismount and clear buildings. Infantry and armored units would support one another closely in this process. It was a combined arms approach to city fighting. Russian doctrine, however, is all about tanks and artillery, so it designed an armored vehicle that would answer the problems that it faced in urban combat in Chechnya. According to Russian doctrine, each main battle tank in an urban setting should be protected by 2 Terminators. While in open terrain, it's the opposite. Each Terminator should be protected by 2 tanks. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, since Russia only has a few Terminators in active service, and it is questionable if it'll be able to manufacture any more thanks to Western sanctions, this doctrine has proven not quite applicable in Ukraine. Russia doesn't seem sure about how to use its new Terminator tanks, and this uncertainty has played out on the battlefield. But more on that in a moment. Despite all the hype, the program had a rocky start in Russia, and Kazakhstan was the first operator of the BMPT Terminator. The latter ordered 10 of the vehicles in 2010 and saw them delivered between 2011 and 2013. Algeria was the second operator, ordering 300 in April 2016, but only 13 wound up being delivered. Azerbaijan and Peru expressed interest in the Terminator tank, but none were ever delivered to those countries. The BMPT Terminator finally found service in its homeland in the late 2010s. In 2017, the Russian ground forces signed a contract agreeing to use the BMPT Terminator. The vehicles were delivered and entered service in the Russian military the following year. The BMPT and its variants are built on the chassis of a T-72 or a T-90 tank. The Russian brass has talked about building a Terminator 3 unit on the chassis of the T-14 Armata. However, given that only about 20 Armata tanks have ever been built, the Terminator 3 is unlikely to come to fruition anytime soon. The BMPT Terminator, like so much of Russia's supposedly most advanced warfighting assets, was initially absent in the invasion of Ukraine. The reasons for this are not known, but given that Putin believed his military's own hype and expected the regime in Kyiv to fall in days, he might have believed that it was not necessary to risk one of Russia's best weapon systems, one which had already seen some sales abroad. When Kyiv did not fall and the Russian military found itself in a long war of attrition, things began to change. The first Terminator units were spotted in Ukraine in May 2022 in the Battle of Severodonetsk, 3 months after the invasion. The deployment of this unit was mostly psychological. Although the BMPT Terminator's combat debut came at a moment when Russia was proving most effective in the war, there were far too few of these vehicles to meaningfully affect the outcome of military operations. Indeed, footage swirled of the BMPT Terminator needing to retreat from its first combat engagement. That would be far from the end of its story in Ukraine, however. The relatively few Terminator armored vehicles have performed better than Russia's main battle tank fleet, which has taken terrible casualties in the face of Ukrainian resistance. Some Russian military bloggers have even implored the Kremlin to replace the outdated T-72 tank with Terminator units. In stark contrast to Russia's traditional tanks, which have often been blown sky high thanks to their ammunition storage design, the BMPT Terminator has taken few casualties. The BMPT Terminator does not have the same design flaw as Russia's main battle tanks, giving it increased survivability, which may be one of the reasons it was able to retreat to safety in May 2022. According to some of the military bloggers, the Terminator has proven formidable in urban and forested environments in Ukraine. The survivability dichotomy between the Terminator and its main battle tank comrades played out after the former's deployment in Ukraine. Although deployed only in small numbers, the first confirmed kill of a BMPT Terminator came in February 2023, 9 months after the unit's initial entry into the war, meaning that these units had survived until then. The BMPT Terminator's design seems well suited for modern warfare. Russia's always emphasized its tank forces, but tank-on-tank combat has proven rare in Ukraine. Indirect fire, especially with the help of drones, has been the norm in Ukraine. Drones and other precision strikes make it far easier to spot tanks and shoot them indirectly over great distances, long before they ever get into range for a traditional tank duel. The death of the tank, so often spoken of in military circles, has proven far from the case in Ukraine though, despite the relative lack of traditional tank combat there. Tanks remain useful for storming enemy positions but the traditional tank gun is less suited for this purpose. After all, if tank-on-tank combat is becoming rarer, tank turrets loaded with rounds to take out other tanks might not be so optimal. This is where the BMPT Terminator has seemed to shine. Footage taken of the Terminator vehicles in Ukraine seems to show them performing well in multi-purpose rapid assault roles. Video footage has also shown Terminator vehicles fighting well at night. In July 2023, Russia's Terminator tank took part in action near Avdiivka, in what may have been part of a staging operation for Russia's offensive toward that settlement later in the year. Russian sources claim that during a night engagement, a Terminator fired 400 high-explosive fragmentation and armor-piercing shells at Ukrainian targets 4 kilometers away. So, how has Ukraine dealt with Russian Terminator vehicles, which have proven among the more effective in the conflict? Has the BMPT Terminator lived up to the hype that some of the Russian military bloggers have assigned to it? Ukraine scored its first confirmed kill of a BMPT Terminator in February 2023, when an artillery unit scored a direct hit on one in Crimea in Luhansk Oblast. The gunners attacked a Terminator that had been sitting idly on a forest road. The unit may have been damaged or had mechanical difficulties before then. The damage to this unit was total. The artillery shell struck the vehicle's ammunition magazine, indicated by the fireball in the blast. Ukraine has also demonstrated its ability to be more innovative in the ways it's destroyed the Terminator tanks. The next confirmed combat loss of a BMPT Terminator came in August 2023 near the town of Spartak in Donetsk Oblast. There, Ukraine once again proved its prowess in drone warfare. Ukraine's Special Forces Group Alpha posted a video showing a swarm of small grenade-bearing first-person view drones chasing down and assaulting one of Russia's Terminator tanks. The Terminator was at least immobilized after the action and needed to be towed by a nearby T-80 main battle tank. That tank was also hit in a drone strike. This incident lacked the fireball that accompanied the Terminator destroyed in the February attack, so the unit may have been salvageable. Ukrainian forces nevertheless gloated about the incident, saying on X, formerly Twitter, "This rare model of enemy weaponry burned down after only a few hits from kamikaze drones. They tried to pull out the downed Terminator with a T-80 tank, but it was also hit." FVP drones have proven to be some of Ukraine's best anti-vehicle weapons, and they are cheap, costing only about $5,000 each. Their cheapness and ease of control with a virtual reality headset has made them popular on both sides of the conflict. The Terminator may have been designed to shoot at upward targets, but it was clearly not prepared to shoot at multiple fast-moving targets like FPV drones. The vehicle may not have been put permanently out of commission, but given that only perhaps 10 of them have been deployed to Ukraine, the loss of even one is a great blow to Russia. The third incident came in September 2023, on the 27th of the month. Ukrainian soldiers, this time in the mutant group, again employed FPV drones, again near Spartak, to damage or destroy a BMPT Terminator. The vehicle had used an infamous cope cage for added protection, but that was not enough to prevent the drones from going to town on it. Given the timing and vicinity of the incident, some observers wondered whether this vehicle was the same as the Terminator damaged in August, but there was no way to verify this. A BREM recovery vehicle was also damaged in the attack. Again, there was no fireball indicating that its ammunition had been torched, but the vehicle was at least temporarily out of commission, and Ukraine proved the concept of attacking Russia's Terminator tanks with drones. Repeat successful drone attacks show one of the Terminator's weaknesses and the weakness of other contemporary armored vehicles. The BMPT Terminator might be armed to the teeth, but it is not designed to hit such fast-moving small targets. The Terminator's engineers were reportedly trying to improve the vehicle's air defense systems as early as 2018, but these improvements were meant to be against helicopters, especially ones capable of firing missiles from distances of up to 5 kilometers. Drone defenses were not mentioned. The Terminator tank comes with other weaknesses too. The vehicle might have a lot in the way of offense, but defensively it is lacking. In contrast to the turret of a main battle tank, a Terminator's turret is much more lightly armored. The vehicle's missiles are armored to protect against explosive fragments and shrapnel, but that's about it. The hull might protect the crew, but the top of the vehicle is vulnerable. Concentrated small arms fire on the turret of a Terminator tank would be sufficient to imperil its weapons. The design is particularly vulnerable to something like a javelin, which attacks its target on a downward trajectory to avoid the most heavily armored features of the tank, or in this case, the BMPT Terminator. Another problem that the Terminator tank has is it lacks the situational awareness that a combined arms approach to warfare would have, no matter how advanced its sensors are. The United States learned through experience in Iraq that armored vehicles cannot replace the situational awareness and rapid response time of infantry support. It's a lesson that Russia clearly has not learned in Ukraine. Although Soviet gear and doctrine still permeates much of the Ukrainian military, it is rapidly absorbing the lessons in doctrine and training afforded by its Western allies, and Ukraine has had much better success in integrating infantry and other arms with its armor than its Russian opponents have. The 2 Ukrainian drone attacks against Terminator tanks serve as a good example. Russia's overall failure of giving its Terminator and other armored vehicles adequate infantry support is one of the reasons why it has lost so many of them in the conflict. The Terminator tank escaped to this fate for a time, but 2 incidents in 2 months demonstrate that Ukraine is adapting to the presence of this vehicle. Interestingly, one of the ways that Ukraine originally sought to adapt to the Russian Terminator tank was to build a model of its own. These vehicles are known as the Stras, or Sentinel. In October 2017, a Ukrainian company called Zhytomyr Armored Plant unveiled an armored vehicle similar to Russia's Terminator tank. It used the chassis of a T-64 main battle tank and had a turret that also looked like the Terminator's. The turret boasted twin ZTM-2 30mm autocannons, a Ukrainian adaptation of the Soviet ZA-42. 2 PKT 7.62mm machine guns served as secondary weapons. The Sentinel also came packed with 4 anti-tank guided missile launchers, with 2 mounted on the side of each turret. There was also an AG-17 30mm automatic grenade launcher in the center on top of the turret. 3 smoke grenade launchers were attached to the sides of the turret as well, giving the vehicle more concealability in the event that it came under attack. The Sentinel was designed for a crew of 3 men. The vehicle, unveiled in 2017, had explosive reactive armor on its front and sides. The driver sat in the front at the center of the hull, with the other 2 crew members at the front of the turret. Each crew member was to have their own hatch. The driver had a periscope, and the top of the turret was mounted with a video monitor, laser rangefinder, and electronic systems. However, despite these seemingly impressive features, Ukraine never put these vehicles into mass production and has not used them in its fight against the Russian invaders. Information on why it chose not to pursue the Sentinel is a little elusive, but it could be because of NATO training. Since Western doctrine insists on close cooperation between infantry and armor, while Russian doctrine tends to solve all problems with tanks and artillery, Ukraine might have no longer seen a need for the production of an expensive tank when it could focus on cheaper, more rapid-fire support systems for its traditional tanks, like anti-armor infantry and drones. Given the limited number of BMPT Terminator tanks that Russia's built, the vehicle's vulnerable turret, and its now demonstrated weakness to drones, it may be that Ukraine was wise to avoid what could have been a costly rabbit hole. The jury is still out on the Terminator's overall effectiveness on the modern battlefield compared to a traditional tank, but the idea promoted by some of the Russian military bloggers that this vehicle would be a major boost for Russia's struggling effort in Ukraine appears to be just that, an idea. What do you think about the BMPT Terminator tank? If it were produced in greater numbers, would it have been better luck on modern battlefields than Russia's main battle tank fleet? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts.
How incompetent can Putin get? Since the war in Ukraine started, he's been losing tanks by the dozens on a daily level. His military has been unable to deliver powerful air and artillery strikes or apply modern military tactics and strategies, and the list doesn't stop there. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world's attention was naturally riveted on the land war. There, Russia's poor command structure and logistical incompetence became apparent within the first week, with the attack on Kyiv stalling. Since then, Russia has been forced to take hundreds of thousands of casualties in a war of attrition that has raged for 20 months and counting. However, Russia's incompetence has extended to the seas as well. In the build-up to the conflict and early stages of the war, military observers feared that Russia would quickly take control of the seas and stage an amphibious attack on Odessa, Ukraine's third largest city. If Russia took Odessa, it would essentially cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea entirely and leave it a poor, landlocked rump state. Such fears proved unfounded. A landing near Odessa never came, Instead, the biggest stories involving Russia's navy in this war have been of its numerous humiliations. What happened? Today, Russia has essentially ceded control of the western Black Sea and is increasingly not even safe within its haven in Crimea. But why has the Russian navy proven so ineffective in the war? To be as fair as we can to Russia, it is and always has been in a bad geostrategic position with regards to the sea. Ever since the days of Peter the Great, Russia has aspired to be a sea power. However, geography makes this difficult to do, as its ports are either contained within choke points, freeze over in the winter, or both. The quest for improved access to the sea has been a vital objective for Russia's foreign policy since the early 18th century, and Russia has never quite been able to achieve this goal. Even at the height of its power during the Soviet Union, unrestricted access to the sea was an objective that still eluded Moscow. In this light, it is understandable why Russia places such a high strategic importance on Crimea, and why it was willing to use military force to secure it. It is one of Russia's few warm water ports. Unfortunately for the Russians, there's a problem. The Turks command the transit points between the Black and Mediterranean seas through their control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles. This control was formalized through the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits. The convention allows complete freedom of transit for the commercial vessels of any country through these straits during peacetime. In times of war, however, Turkey, if it is not a party to the conflict, can close the straits to transiting ships unless they are returning to their bases. 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention's wartime provisions for the first time, refusing Russian naval vessels in the Mediterranean access to the Black Sea. For example, at the end of November 2022, 2 Russian warships left the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal after 9 months of idling after Turkey forbid them from transiting through the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the Black Sea. The effect of the Montreux Convention has been to cut off Russia's ability to reinforce its Black Sea fleet. For Ukraine, this was a significant piece of diplomatic aid. It immediately made Russian naval officers more cautious, knowing that every ship in the fleet was precious. Even so, it seemed far-fetched that Ukraine would be able to significantly impede the operations of the Russian Black Sea fleet. That opinion quickly started to change, however. Ukraine proved its ability to strike at the Russian navy early in the war. 3 days after it invaded Ukraine, and on the same day the Turks invoked the Montreux Convention, Russia captured the strategically important port of Berdyansk. The Ukrainian military and Western observers were understandably concerned that the Russian ships that piled into Berdyansk could either land troops in the rear of Ukraine's southern lines or attack Odessa. Then, at about 7:45 a.m. on March 24th, exactly a month after the invasion, the landing craft Saratov mysteriously exploded and sank in port at Berdyansk. Ships of the Saratov's class, the Alligator-class tank landing ship, can land up to 425 soldiers or marines, with armored support of either 40 infantry fighting vehicles or 20 tanks. The loss of this vessel was thus a significant blow to Russia's ability to conduct amphibious operations. How did this happen? From the beginning of the conflict, NATO has provided Ukraine with excellent intelligence, and Ukraine's intelligence units got the word that the Saratov was loaded with munitions at the time of the attack. Ukraine used this intelligence and a Cold War-era Tochka-U Scarab short-range ballistic missile to carry out the deed. The Tochka-U has a range of about 120 kilometers. We do not know how many of these missiles Ukraine used in the attack, but what is known is that Russia's modern air defense systems should have easily been able to intercept these Soviet weapons. Russian media at the time reported that its forces had done just that, although the real story came in July, when the Saratov was raised from the depths of the sea. Russia's supposedly modern air defense network failed to act against a much older weapon system. Meanwhile, 2 other ships, the Seyza-Kunikov and Novocherkassk, were seen on video departing from the flaming Saratov. They also suffered damage in the attack and were forced to retreat to Crimea. 11 sailors on board the Saratov died in the incident. Ukraine's next assault on the Russian navy would become the most famous of the war. This was the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in April 2022. This incident was apparently so humiliating for Russia that its Ministry of Defense still offers no details about what happened and avoids talking about it in public, to the point that the families of the sailors on board are still left in the dark about the fates of their loved ones. How exactly this incident unfolded is still unclear. After the successful attack, American sources reported that the Ukrainians had used liquid-fueled Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, sending them to coordinates provided by US intelligence by way of a P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft that flew out of Italy and looked around the Black Sea. Ukraine denied this report, however. According to the Ukrainians, April 13, 2022 was the worst day to sink the cruiser because the weather was so bad for such a precise, premeditated attack. The coastline was covered with low, dark rain clouds on that day. The Ukrainian radars in the area had a limited 18-kilometer range because of the bad weather. Knowing this, the Moskva's crew got a wee bit careless. According to Ukrainian sources, at the time of the invasion we had no over-the-horizon radars and Russia knew it. But since the clouds were very low and a signal in this corridor between the water and the clouds had nowhere to go, the radar suddenly reached and identified Moskva. The ship's crew seemingly ignored this potentially deadly situation and were so lax about their security that the air defense systems were inactive. They had not noticed that they had just sailed to within the Neptune's 200-kilometer range. Ukraine may have at this point used a Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone to distract the Moskva and then launch the missiles. For a while after the attack, Ukrainian crews did not know what happened, but radar soon revealed that 4 Russian ships were rushing to the Moskva from different directions. Later, the Ukrainians realized that a tugboat had also been dispatched from Crimea, hoping to save the ailing ship. At this point, the weather cooperated again too. When a storm began at sea and made rescue operations much harder, it became impossible to save the Moskva then, and it sank beneath the waves. Hundreds of Russian sailors reportedly saw their flagship get hit by 2 Neptune missiles. The Moskva incident is more baffling because the ship was an air defense cruiser. If running properly, the Moskva should have gotten as much as 4 minutes of warning that the Ukrainian cruise missiles were on their way. The Russian cruiser also had a triple layer of protection against such air attacks. Its defenses included the S-300F surface-to-air missiles, 9K-33 OSA air defense missiles, AK-360 close-in 30mm cannons, chaff, decoys, and electronic defense systems. However, no one recorded the Moskva using any of these systems against the Ukrainian cruise missiles. The ship just sat there. Why were none of these systems active? Was the ship's radar system defective? We might never know the answer. Whatever the reason, the Moskva was the largest Russian vessel sunk since World War II, and the first loss of a Russian flagship since the Russo-Japanese War. Russia says that 18 crew members died. Other sources say it was as many as 600. Either way, the incident shocked the Kremlin. With Ukraine's demonstrated anti-ship capabilities and no way for it to bring replacements thanks to the Turks' invocation of the Montreux Convention, Russia became even more cautious about how it would use its naval assets. Since this incident, the Black Sea Fleet has been bottled up around its base in Sevastopol, Crimea. With this knowledge, Ukrainian troops confidently strode forward with their Kherson counteroffensive between August and November of 2022, safe in the knowledge that the Russian Navy would not be bothering them with missile attacks from the Black Sea, let alone amphibious operations behind their lines. Even with the Russian Navy's retreat to the relatively safe Crimea, Ukraine wasn't done showing off its prowess in sinking ships. Next up was the rescue tug Vasily Bek. While far less spectacular a target than the Moskva, these tugs are important to the maintenance of a naval fleet. This role is especially important in the Black Sea due to Russia's inability to reinforce its fleet. This ship was new too, being launched in 2016 and commissioned in 2017. On June 17, 2022, Ukrainian forces attacked the Vasily Bek when it was on its way to resupply Russian soldiers stationed on Snake Island, a place already made famous from the start of the war, when the garrison there used colorful language in response to Russia's demands for surrender. The Ukrainians hit the Vasily Bek with 2 Harpoon anti-ship cruise missiles. The ship stood no chance and went down, with about 10 Russian KIA in the incident and a $25 million Tor air defense system on board that was supposed to be placed on the island. On June 30th, Russia evacuated its garrison from Snake Island. Moscow claimed that this move was an act of goodwill in recognition of a humanitarian corridor that was part of its grain export deal with Ukraine. In reality, Russia evacuated its troops from Snake Island because the attack on the Vasily Bek made its military brass realize that it's too risky to reinforce and resupply the outpost. It was a tacit admission that Russia had ceded the Black Sea west of Crimea to Ukraine. But the Ukrainians weren't done yet. The Olenigorsky Gornyak, a Rapucha-class landing ship, was Ukraine's next target. On August 4, 2023, Ukraine used drone boats to swarm the ship and its neighbors when it was docked in the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Not all the drones made it through Russian defenses, but the attack on the Olenogorsky Gornyak succeeded. The ship did not sink, but it needed to be put in a dry dock to repair the heavy damage. It's unlikely that the ship will return to action anytime soon. The water drone Ukraine used in the attack was a new low-visibility grey boat that can be operated via remote control. The drone boat has a high payload, able to carry a 300-kilogram warhead up to a range of 800 kilometers. The boat also features a satellite communications array at its rear. A Ukrainian operator of these drones explained their low profile was designed to exploit weaknesses in Russian ship defenses. It was an adaptation from their earlier attacks, where Russian ships spotted drone boats and sank them with artillery and small arms fire once they got to within visual range. The attack on the Olenogorsky Gornyak reveals that Ukraine has absorbed these lessons and is adapting with its newer drone boats. Russia claims that it foiled a similar attack on an oil facility after this incident, but as always, these claims should be treated with skepticism. Most recently, Ukraine attacked targets in Sevastopol, the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and other targets in Crimea. On September 13th, Ukrainian forces struck the Sergo-Ordzhonikidze shipyard in Sevastopol, a major repair base. Ukraine reportedly used 10 Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missiles in the attack. Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that air defense systems in the area shot 7 of these missiles down, but that effort was clearly not enough. The Russian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine Rostov-on-Don and the large landing ship Minsk were struck and destroyed by the Storm Shadows. Key infrastructure on the base was also damaged in this incident. However, the missile attack was only the climax of the operation. Other units were essential for shaping it. Prior to the attack, Ukrainian special operators seem to have destroyed one of Russia's nearby S-400 air defense systems and took control of an oil facility that housed a local radar unit. By downing these systems, the Ukrainians set the stage for the strike on Sevastopol. It would only be the first of several attacks on Crimean targets in the weeks ahead. On September 14th, Ukraine again struck at the Russian Navy on the seas. Its general staff said it had targeted 2 ships in the western Black Sea and released a video showing a Russian patrol ship appearing to come under attack by drone boats. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed that one of its ships, the Sergei Kotov, had been attacked, but repelled the assault. Meanwhile, that same day, Ukrainian forces used cruise missiles and drones to destroy a Russian air defense network in the Crimean city of Yevpatoria. Then, on September 22nd, Ukraine launched another attack on Sevastopol. Ukraine sent several Storm Shadow cruise missiles at targets there. Russia claims that it shot most of them down, but one made it through, hitting the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters. The attack set the main building ablaze, and Russian officials said at least one service member went missing in the aftermath. Ukraine alleges that the strike was timed to coincide with a meeting of high-level Russian officials. Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, says that 2 Russian commanders were badly injured in the attack. Later, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said the strike had killed Viktor Sokolov, the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, along with 33 others. No independent source verified this claim, however. Sokolov reportedly attended a soccer awards ceremony to prove he was not dead on September 27th, although there are claims that this was a duplicate. As always, we should know more in time. What we do know is that the Institute for the Study of War confirmed an attack on the 744th Communications Center of the Command of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And the problems are only piling on for Russia. In late September, the Biden administration seemingly finally gave Ukraine what it has wanted for so long. Although it was not officially announced, it's likely that Ukraine will be getting ATACMS missiles in the near future. These weapons can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away, 50 kilometers further than the Storm Shadow. And unlike the Storm Shadow, which requires a riskier launch from a fighter jet, ATACMS can be fired from Ukraine's HIMARS platforms on the ground. ATACMS would be ideal for launching attacks on Sevastopol. Meanwhile, if Ukraine gets ATACMS, it's also possible that Germany will agree to supply Ukrainians with Taurus air-launched cruise missiles that have even greater range than ATACMS. This weapon system would be ideal for targeting the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. A drone attack already damaged the Kerch Bridge a year ago. This scenario would be far more threatening. Ukraine has renewed its attacks on Crimea for a few reasons. First, Russia has allowed the grain export deal that Turkey and the UN brokered in July 2022 to expire. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has resumed its blockade of such exports, making it a more important target for Ukraine to destroy. Crimea is also the linchpin of Russia's logistics in Ukraine. Being able to resupply its troops from Crimea is vital to the Russian war effort. Ukrainian disruption of Russian Navy logistics from Crimea is one of the reasons why Moscow now considers it too dangerous to send ships to the west of the peninsula. An attack on Russia's ports in Crimea would disrupt the supply chain to all the branches of Russia's military, and it appears that the Black Sea Fleet is helpless in stopping such attacks. Crimea is also a highly political target, with Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that this war started in Crimea and will end in Crimea. The recapture of Crimea would be the greatest victory for the Ukrainian military, a highly symbolic measure of its triumph. The stakes are just as high or even higher for Putin. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, he sold his occupation and annexation of Crimea to the Russian public as his crowning foreign policy achievement. If Russian occupation of Crimea becomes untenable through missile and drone attacks, and supplying the Russian forces in other parts of Ukraine from Crimea also becomes untenable, Putin's political position at home erodes, and the entire Russian war effort risks breaking down. The war has already put Russia through isolation, economic hardship, and hundreds of thousands of casualties. If Russia cannot gain anything from the hostilities and winds up losing Crimea too, or if it at least cannot use the peninsula for strategic purposes, it's difficult to see how Putin would be able to remain in power, which he plans to do until at least 2036. In this scenario, Russian elites may decide that the time is right for their country to finally get a new leader. There is a presidential election in Russia in 2024. Although elections in Russia are only formalities, the 2024 election could serve as a pretext to oust Putin from power if the war goes too poorly between now and then. It's understandable why Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet would become an increasingly high priority for Ukraine. All wars are first and foremost political. Even if things don't turn out that way, Ukraine's effective neutralization of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is an astounding military achievement. Early in the war, Ukraine forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat to what it believed was the safety of Crimea. Now, through the actions of its intelligence units, special operators, and missile and air units, it's showing that not even Crimea is safe. If ATACMS and Taurus missiles soon arrive, that point will only be made clearer. What do you think will come next in the war at sea? Will Ukraine soon use ATACMS missiles to destroy Russian ships and docks in Sevastopol? Is the Kerch Bridge safe for Russia? Let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Those who say Ukraine's offensive is going too slow almost always have a poor understanding of the nature of modern warfare, or lack a real appreciation for the difficulty of reclaiming lost territory. Despite Ukraine's undeniable military competency, they've been unable to push Russian forces out of their territory thus far. But why? At a recent ceremony paying tribute to the memory of fallen Ukrainian soldiers, President Volodymyr Zelensky encouraged optimism and unity, even as an undeniable feeling of solemnity swept over the procession. It was Ukraine's Day of Defenders, and as he reflected on the sacrifices which had saved his country from complete collapse, Zelensky reaffirmed his belief that victory would come. Plenty of pessimistic armchair generals around the world are casting their lots in disagreement of late. With Ukraine's counteroffensive struggling to move the needle, US aid slowing to a trickle, and notoriously pro-Russian candidates winning elections in neighboring countries like Slovakia, optimism has certainly faded. These are tough times for the Ukrainian people. They are in a dogfight for their very lives, and so much of their future is out of their control. Still, we can emphatically stress that despite these setbacks, Ukraine is still winning the war. Sure, there hasn't been a simple or clear path to victory, but nothing in war, as Clausewitz famously said, is easy or simple, especially when you are the underdog. The Ukrainian armed forces have set some incredibly high standards for themselves over the past year. Some argue they are not living up to these standards in light of the equipment and training they've received. In today's video, our military experts explain why that is an unfair claim. Ukrainian forces began laying the foundations of their ongoing military offensive last winter, a period corresponding with a marked decrease in operational tempo, as Ukrainian forces absorbed what was, in hindsight, an incredibly poor attempt by Russia to reclaim the initiative. This calculation, to sit back and prepare, was a necessary risk. The fact that Russia visibly struggled to retake the city of Bakhmut in this period reinforces the difficulty of conducting offensive operations against well-entrenched defenders. Ultimately, it cost them over 50,000 soldiers to do so, a staggering number given the fact their objective was largely devoid of strategic or political value. Yes, Ukraine was pushed out of Bakhmut, but they bled Putin dry in the process, with most analysts in agreement that Ukraine inflicted 5 Russian casualties for every one of their own. In the end, rabid Russian bloggers finally got a tidbit of positive propaganda to send to the folks back home. As one commentator aptly put it, though one could now make the argument that Bakhmut has now the largest reserve of sunflower fertilizer in the world in the wake of the bloody winter of fighting to take it, Russian troops faced significant difficulties attempting to attack during the winter. They were unprepared for offensive action, relying on mercenaries rather than outfitting their own forces with the winter clothing and equipment they needed to thrive on the frozen battlefield. Hypothermia was a big threat for Russian troops, as Ukraine's 3D-printed munition-porting drones drifted lazily overhead. You could see many Russian soldiers moving lethargically even as grenades fell into their foxholes, unable to escape the blast, a sign they were already falling victim to the harsh conditions before the threat of imminent death could register. When you can barely keep fresh conscripts warm or fed and struggle to keep vehicles operating at the tail end of your supply lines, maneuver warfare on prepared defensive positions becomes next to impossible. We now know why Russia could barely move the needle last winter. There was no chance Mobiks or mercenaries alike would ever be able to conduct meaningful combined arms operations when you factor in the lack of experience for the former and the lack of trust in the latter. So, what was Putin to do? When cruelty supplants logic, you get Russia's shameless human wave attacks, sending clearly expendable conscripts into the breach in clear view of Ukrainian artillery observers and drones. One Atlantic Council study revealed how, as this offensive tactic became mainstream, catastrophic losses threatened to undermine morale within the ranks of Putin's invading army. It certainly revealed a lack of military options, after a year of embarrassing battlefield setbacks, highlighting the lack of available armored fighting vehicles, which would have at least offered marginally better protection than what most Russians got. That is, if the Russians knew how to employ them properly. All evidence thus far points to the contrary. Case in point, the attempt to take the town of Vuhledar around the same time, where Russian forces wrote off 25 main battle tanks to Ukrainian mines and artillery fire. In the pandemonium, Wagner, Patriot PMC, and Russian forces suffered a catastrophic loss of communication, which resulted in the destruction of hundreds more armored vehicles. Even Russia knew these types of losses weren't sustainable. Well aware that many Ukrainian forces had been withdrawn into Europe for intensive combined arms training on new Western weapons platforms, they knew they'd have to brace for a coming spring counteroffensive. And so the Russians did the one thing they were still competent at, using bulldozers and excavators to build an interlocking network of tiered defenses, including miles upon miles of minefields, command bunkers, tank traps, dragon's teeth, barbed wire, and of course, trenches. Each barrier offered multiple fallback trenches, enabling retreating defenders to lure attackers into successive kill zones. Artillery was massed to repel attackers at strategically designated choke points. Helicopters were used to target onrushing Ukrainian AFVs. The best Russian troops were tactically withheld as mobile reserves until Ukraine revealed its true axis of attack. Given as much as a year to prepare in some places, you can imagine how serious these defenses, considered the largest defensive fortifications since World War II, actually are. Unsurprisingly, some of Russia's most notable fighting came in the earliest days of Ukraine's current summer counteroffensive, as well-equipped defenders caught initial Ukrainian mechanized convoys in the opening phases of probing these defenses, destroying and damaging many of their new Western vehicles in the process. For the past few months, Russia has been fighting from prepared positions, from which they were fully anticipating Ukrainian counterattacks. Last time the Russians did this in the Donbass, the war stretched on for 8 years between 2014 and 2022. Ukraine never veiled its intentions of achieving a breakthrough somewhere along the front at a time and place of their choosing this summer. To succeed, they needed a steady flow of Western aid and supplies, which, as both a credit to and an indictment of Western governments, they ultimately received, though not on the timetable Ukraine yearned for. Ukraine then needed to ensure their Western benefactors that they could be trusted with this equipment. which meant training on the new platforms to rehearse their intended use cases in eastern Ukraine. As part of this, they had to make sure they could mass the requisite force in reserve to exploit any breakthrough. This introduces another problem Ukraine has been facing. As any good soldier will tell you, there is a 3-to-1 rule at play when you are trying to penetrate a prepared defensive position. You need 3 times more attackers and equipment to beat an entrenched defender, and that is where Ukraine still struggles. As a far smaller nation with a fraction of the GDP Russia once enjoyed, it cannot afford to sustain the incredible human losses Russia apparently barely bats an eye at if it hopes to emerge victorious. The style of fighting Ukraine is trying to become proficient at, Western combined arms warfare, requires both manpower, materiel, professionalism, and technical aptitude. And if Ukraine wantonly throws away its trained forces into the meat grinder, it will take months to train up replacements on newly integrated armored vehicles, counter-battery radars, and engineering vehicles in their stead. As long as they are on the defensive, Russia does not have this problem. The problem they do have is the fact they are still losing about 3 times as many troops as Ukraine while on the defensive. While they have admittedly knocked out roughly half of the US-delivered Bradley infantry fighting vehicles over the course of the offensive, another problem is that the vast majority of these vehicles not only survive long enough to be pulled back and repaired, but that, contrary to most crews in Russian armored vehicles, the Ukrainian crews survive. CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams witnessed this firsthand on a recent tour of the front lines. In an interview with Serhiy Gavrilyuk, a Bradley crew member, he mentioned how simply driving the American-made vehicle into combat struck fear into the enemy. "It scares them," he said. "When we hear their radio and they hear that Bradley coming, they start to run away." Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, ex-commander of the US Army in Europe, said this reaction makes sense. If you go back to the Cold War, the United States realized that if we were in a conflict with the Soviet Union, we were going to be grossly outnumbered. And so the whole concept was fight outnumbered and win. And the only way you can do that is if you've got longer range. You're able to hit a Soviet tank before it even sees you. Yes, that was the logic behind the Bradley's Cold War creation, facing an enemy whose manpower vastly exceeded that of the Americans. Today, the Ukrainian forces operate under the same conditions, which is why the Bradleys have been so critical. Improved survivability offered by Western vehicles enables Ukrainian crews who have been in a firefight to continue fighting in new vehicles, while Russia is forced to inject green conscripts with inadequate training to do the same. Here's another issue. While the Ukrainian front is massive, said to be the distance between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, it also isn't. In World War II, the Allies had to contend with massive oceans and vast distances when planning their offensive against the Axis. In a way, this played into their hands for a time. Germany, for example, didn't know whether an invasion was coming across the English Channel, down in North Africa, or somewhere else in the Balkans. With no satellites, drones, or high-altitude aerial reconnaissance, it was far easier to veil one's intentions and achieve surprise. The problem with Ukraine's offensive is that their intentions have been telegraphed from the very beginning. If it wants to expel Russia from the east, everyone knows what they have to do. They have to sever the Kerch Bridge supply route into Crimea and sever the overland supply routes into occupied southeastern Ukraine. The first objective would not only boost morale as a serious propaganda victory, it would severely limit Russian offensive capabilities in and beyond Crimea. The Kerch Bridge is the lifeline for all Russian forces in the region. Previous Ukrainian attacks with sea drones and other munitions have caused temporary shutdowns, but could not permanently damage the structure. Crimea remains a valuable military asset for Putin. It is essentially an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a base from which he is able to launch cruise missiles, airstrikes, and other ballistic missiles from naval vessels moored at the port of Sevastopol, or if he pleases, rest and resupply frontline forces. Short of permanently destroying the Kerch Bridge and staging an audacious amphibious assault for which Ukraine lacks the requisite materiel, it looks like Crimea will remain in Russian hands for the foreseeable future. The lack of military options here ultimately made it even more likely for Ukraine to target the second alternative, the overland supply routes to southeastern Ukraine. Railway lines along the Sea of Azov have been sustaining Russian defenders for over a year now. They are also responsible for part of the inflow of supplies into Crimea. Ukraine knows that virtually everything south of Mariupol relies on overland supply routes to subsist. So if Ukraine wants to inflict the most damage on Russia's southern war effort, the furthest from its bases in Russian territory, it would need to target the roads coming and going from Mariupol and Melitopol. Several weeks ago, Ukraine confirmed that it had succeeded in breaking the first line of Russian defenses, but looking at any map of Russia's prepared defensive network, you begin to see the scale of the problem. While Russia has proven its utter incompetence in this war, even they know that Ukraine is trying to get to either Mariupol or Melitopol. This is why the current offensive has not achieved the same outcome as the Fall 22 operations in Kharkiv and Kherson, even though it has achieved notable successes in other areas. The Fall 22 offensives had been completely and thoroughly veiled in secrecy. Russia had no idea when and where the breakthrough would come. Conferring with American intelligence officers and other officials, plans were amended to capitalize on Russia's weak ISR capabilities and maximize the momentum which would come. Nobody, not Putin, not anyone outside of a select body of Western and Ukrainian officials, predicted that the first attacks would come at Kharkiv. Reinforcing the Kherson axis where the initial blow did come, Russia and the world soon realized that the true left hook was thrown in the north. The defenses around Kharkiv were weak enough that thousands of onrushing vehicles and soldiers could exploit and overrun them. Uncharacteristically, Russia seems to have learned from this glaring strategic mistake. The current offensive has been significantly less successful than the prior in retaking lost ground. But unlike the 2022 offensive, Russia was not deceived as to where the attack would unfold. Since Ukraine needed time to receive new vehicles and training, Russia made the most of it, virtually fortifying the entire front. Unlike the Kharkiv and Kherson attacks, this time Russia made sure the Ukrainians would have to inch through vast minefields sown with thousands of mines. This time, Russia would engineer a front which would essentially strip Ukraine of the token advantage it had taken into the previous counteroffensive: mobility and combined arms maneuver warfare. Ukraine has had to settle on slowly and methodically taking its objectives, then trying to reclaim territory with wave after wave of human meat shields. Russia has the numbers to do this, but it lacks the will to exploit tactical gains into strategic victories. Most recently, on October 9th, it mounted a localized counteroffensive of its own near Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast and Orikhiv in western Zaporizhia Oblast in an attempt to draw Ukraine away from its gains in the Robotyne area. 3 Russian battalions participated, driving forward with convoys of armored vehicles and trucks supported by airstrikes and artillery barrages. The attack went as expected, attempting to encircle Avdiivka, one of the most heavily fortified areas of the Donetsk Oblast front line, a task for which military analysts argued would require far more military forces than Russia actually committed. Video surfaced of vast columns of vehicles knocked out by Ukrainian artillery. Limited offensives like these are indicative of 2 things. One, that Putin and his generals sense the importance of pinning down Ukrainian reserves so they cannot penetrate critical areas on the front in the Zaporizhia Oblast, perhaps even a sign that the Ukrainian offensive is still grinding forward, and 2, that it has learned that it needs to stage spoiling attacks like these if it's to hope to stop Ukraine altogether. As things stand, Russia is running out of options, according to Colonel Seth Krumrich, vice president at a global security consultancy. If I were Russia today, I would punch, because the Ukrainians are going to find a breach, and they're going to punch through it. Removing pressure on itself by staging limited offensives may be the only way to delay the Ukrainians until winter itself arrives. Ukraine, for its part, has claimed that it may be able to maintain its momentum through the winter. If the cold weather hits immediately, noted Ukraine's Eastern Forces spokesman, the ground will remain frozen and heavy machinery will be able to move on it. Only time will tell whether this is the case or not. With the offensive ongoing now for the better part of 4 months, it's important to take stock of what it has achieved. First, let us stress that nobody has seen a near-peer conflict between 2 semi-modern powers in decades, and that nobody, including us, can claim to know exactly how the war will unfold. It is counterproductive to try to put a timetable on Ukraine's armed forces, but they are not going to give up without a fight. Even if the advance along the Robotyne axis stagnates, Ukraine will remain committed to what could potentially turn into a decades-long guerrilla war. Even this would not eliminate them from victory contention. Look at what happened to the Russians in Afghanistan. Still, over the past 4 months, Ukraine has managed to retake half the territory Russia captured earlier this year, pierced Russia's vaunted Surovikin line of defense, threatened Russian logistics by striking deep into Crimea, and deprived Russia control of the Western Black Sea. These are not insignificant gains. And yet, the expected breakthrough still hasn't materialized, and it's honestly not all that hard to see why. Ukraine spent weeks probing for weaknesses along the front lines, but by the time they were ready to mass and exploit any of them, they discovered that they critically lacked Western mine clearing and engineering support vehicles, which would enable safe passage through the defensive quagmire. To adapt, they had individual soldiers crawling forward with minesweepers under small arms fire, mortars, and artillery rounds to chart the path ahead, with predictably slow results. In addition, nobody expected Russia to recommit its dwindling force of attack helicopters into the midsummer crucible, but this they did, achieving limited successes against the onrushing pockets of Leopard and Bradley fighting vehicles as Ukraine suffered from a lack of mobile air defenses. Still, by mid-August there was visual confirmation of Russia losing its 40th Ka-52, with more losses reported. Russia had inflicted significant damage on Ukraine's advancing columns, but only at a serious cost to its own combat capabilities. This then encouraged Ukraine to change its tactics yet again. Rather than probe enemy defenses in the hopes of throwing their weight at the critical point and causing a complete Russian collapse, they started to focus on the long term. Russian artillery units were accustomed to engaging in artillery duels with enemy troops as their troops advanced. Pretty soon, however, they began noticing the enemy's guns falling silent. Ukrainian gunners only responded when its forces came under Russian artillery fire, and they did so with precision radar and counter-battery fires, specifically targeting and destroying Russian artillery emplacements. This has served to shrink the gap in Russia's biggest advantage of the entire war thus far: its disproportionate quantity of available artillery. Russia remains invested in destroying the ever-elusive HIMARS batteries, wreaking havoc among artillery of their own. With an influx of even more units donated to the Ukrainian armed forces, Russian assets remain almost as vulnerable as they were when the weapon system first arrived on the battlefield. We know this is a critical problem for Russian forces. Last July, they even fired one of their own generals, commander of the 52nd Combined Arms Army, for complaining that the Russian Ministry of Defense was failing its troops. There was, he said, scant reconnaissance or protection for Russian artillery, which proved to be increasingly vulnerable to Ukrainian strikes. The ongoing destruction of Russian artillery remains a core objective for Ukrainian forces. It has and will continue to severely limit Russia's ability to conduct meaningful offensive operations of its own. Add to this the calculated targeting of Russia's high command in Ukraine, and you start to see what they are building at. If they can attrit Russian leadership, destroy expensive air defenses, missiles, radars with small-scale raids, and wreak havoc among Russian artillery batteries, its troops will lose confidence in their leaders, introducing new weaknesses in Russia's ongoing quest to maintain command and control on the battlefield. Yes, Ukraine may not be on the cusp of the breakthrough many Westerners anticipated at the start of last summer, but it is far from losing ground. But what do you think? Will this underdog come out on top and over time send Putin's army running for the hills? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Why has Russia done so badly in its invasion of Ukraine? And what explains Ukraine's successful defense against its aggressive larger neighbor? And will its current counter-offensive be effective? If you've read or watched the news at all in the last year, you've probably heard a dozen different takes on how and why things have gone the way they have. Explanations for the war's current state range from Russian incompetence to Western military and logistical support to Ukrainian grit and superior strategy. The reality is that all of these factors and many more have led to this stage in the war, and will determine how the conflict may change in the next year. There is also another explanation, once recently pointed out by Telegraph associate editor and British Army veteran Tom Nichols, which can also tell us a lot about the war's future. It involves a way of looking at conflicts which is nicely summed up by an old military adage. Armies don't fight wars. Nations fight wars. Armies just do the shooting. Let's go over what Nichols means by this phrase, its significance for Ukraine and Russia's strategies, and what it tells us about how modern wars are really won today, both on and off the battlefield. First, in order to really understand the chances of Ukraine or Russia's strategies leading to success, we need to consider the conflict in terms of national will, not just battlefield activity. The collective will of a nation to reach certain military, economic, political, and societal objectives is critical. It can determine whether a country can coordinate and deploy resources against an enemy. In the West, there was a lack of political and economic will to nation-build in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as a result, military superiority alone couldn't achieve the desired outcomes. Russia is now dealing with its own, far more severe crisis of national will. something made worse by Putin's brutal, corrupt, and authoritarian rule. Ukraine, on the other hand, has seen collective national will manifest in all sorts of places since the start of the invasion. Nichols points out that another way to analyze national will in a military campaign is through the geographic lens of deep, close, and rear operations. In the most straightforward sense, deep operations consist of things like long-range strikes and precise raids behind enemy lines to disrupt key assets. Close operations are generally thought of as brutal, close-quarters combat necessary to take territory, and rear operations consist of non-combat support elements like headquarters, supply lines, and logistics bases. Like other elements in military doctrine, these three areas are not exact guidelines for warfighting, but instead a lens, or loose conceptual framework, that helps everyone from commanders to analysts assess issues, opportunities, and the larger operational environment of a conflict. The biggest challenge for anyone engaged in a military campaign is to align the various parts and sections of a country to serve the broader goal of warfare. This means that everybody from foot soldiers and drone operators to civilians watching their TV screens back home must be on board with the conflict. In this sense, Nichols is very right to point out that deep, close, and rear operations can be understood as far more than just physical, geographic elements. Rather, they entail what he calls the architecture needed for the battle in the mind, the area where wars are really won or lost. What does this mean? For one thing, modern conflicts, especially long ones, are rarely won just through overwhelming firepower or number of troops. Instead, they require the combination of many disparate elements from across society to bolster the morale of one nation and destroy another's will to fight. The first takeaway, while obvious, is one Putin seems to have forgotten. A military strategy lacking in national or international support is far, far less likely to succeed. As Nichols argues, in this broader understanding, deep operations are often psychological, aiming to intimidate and unsettle the enemy with a range of tools. For instance, General Kirilla Badanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, recently posted a tweet where he spent 30 seconds staring at the camera without saying a word. This plans of silence video showed a stoic self-confidence meant to terrify any Russian conscript who watched it, an ominous "you're not ready for what's coming." Other psychological deep operations are aimed at allies around the world, intended to drum up external support and convey the message that we're on the same team. With Ukraine, we see this every time President Zelensky or Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov have traveled abroad to show that unlike Putin's Russia, their country is part of the rules-based international order. We saw this strategy in full swing earlier in July, during the annual NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. As the event kicked off, the city's walls were full of blue and yellow posters, Ukrainian flags hung on every street, and many locals told stories about their own memories of Russian imperialism. Zelensky appeared to a screaming crowd of thousands calling for Ukraine's NATO accession and increased support in the years ahead. His appearance was a strong signal that Ukraine is on NATO's team, and that both share a common vision of the future. And this type of deep operation seems to be highly effective. Karolina Vitoniene, a Vilnius local, who watched alongside friends and her daughter, told reporters that it was very emotional. "We understand that they, the Ukrainians, are fighting for our freedom as well. Each of us remembers what it's like to live under occupation, or knows the stories from their families." It is this sort of common cause that has helped with Zelensky's massive international support. The 37-year-old recalled her childhood nightmares that a Russian tank would roll over her home, stating that she wanted her daughter to grow up in a world where that would not be possible. For a war effort to succeed in our modern, hyper-connected world, this type of support is critical, and to maintain it, the leaders of a military campaign must be constantly engaged in outreach to their coalition of international supporters. Doing so gives Ukraine economic leverage over Russia, keeps vital military supplies flowing into the country, and ensures that the Ukrainian cause remains seen as morally righteous and worthy of support by key allies. Psychological rear operations are also critical for a successful military campaign. They offer hope to a nation's own citizens, aiming to keep morale high and a national spirit intact, even while they remain under constant threat. Ukraine's leaders have also engaged heavily in this sort of rear operation, using everything from Twitter to in-person visits to the front lines, to Zelensky's appearance at the Kyiv Book Fair. Some of the most potent of these efforts resulted in words which inspired millions of Ukrainians to fight tooth and nail for their country. Remember the video of Ukraine's cabinet remaining in Kyiv just after the invasion began? or the now famous statement, "I need ammunition, not a ride." This sort of determination from a nation's leaders can have an enormous impact on citizens' willingness to fight and possibly die for a cause. It's not just words during moments of crisis either. Some psychological rear operations are effective because they take place during ordinary moments worth defending. Zelensky attending a book fair might seem like a weird thing for a wartime president to do, but it makes perfect sense through his lens. Natalia Gomenyuk, the book fair's events curator, asked one reporter, "What is democracy? How do we experience freedom? What do we mean by inclusivity or the unity of the country? And are these values really worth fighting and dying for?" The war made these questions real instead of abstract, and Zelensky's presence at such an ordinary event signaled to his audience that he does not take them for granted. This can be an incredibly powerful tool during wartime, keeping the civilian population on board with military operations, even when there is no end in sight. By showing that normal life is something worth fighting and putting your life on the line for, Ukrainian officials offer both a rallying cry and a goal for post-conflict existence. Even close operations, usually thought of as only brutal frontline combat, have a psychological dimension. Soldiers need to be inspired both before and during their deployments, especially since life in the trenches is often miserable and terrifying. In Ukraine, the military has set up multiple organizations to deal with this problem. One, the Center for Moral and Psychological Support, helps mentally prepare soldiers for the dangers and stresses of forward deployment. The head of the center, Captain Andriy Karachevsky, had PTSD himself and has explained that it's an intervention prior to combat. We are part of the weaponry. We give them skills to deal with combat. How a soldier is to understand the range of emotions from anger to grief to confusion and many more that he may feel. How a soldier is to manage what he is feeling both there and afterwards. The other goal of such centers is to prevent as many mental health crises as possible among active and returning soldiers, by promoting inclusive and emotionally aware leadership among battlefield commanders. The hope is that doing so will prevent Ukraine's overstretched armed forces from breaking down. It's also a way to change stigmas around mental health by making it easier and more acceptable for people to seek out psychological help. Much like inspiring speeches or visits to the book fair, this type of operation is just another way Ukraine's leaders are working to keep their entire nation on board with a war that doesn't look to be stopping anytime soon. And like the others, it shows us a fundamental truth about conflicts. Often the victor is whichever side can best maintain and channel a sense of collective purpose and unity of action. And as important as the psychological elements of a military campaign can be, the underlying moral structure of a military campaign can be just as critical. These values form a thread, which can either bind a society together or allow it to fray under the stresses of conflict. The moral values supporting Ukraine's campaign include self-determination, freedom from violence, and democracy, a powerful combination for supporters both at home and around the world. In Putin's Russia, on the other hand, the thread is one of grievance, fear, self-interest, and domination. Unlike in Ukraine, these are not the sort of values that make for a unified and successful campaign. Instead, they are the type of ideas that erode a nation's moral and psychological foundations. Put another way, the climate of Putin's Russia makes it pretty clear to conscripts and generals alike that their lives and opinions are meaningless. Basically, they're not the sort of ideals that can inspire some poor conscript on the front lines that what he is doing really matters at all. These ideas are part of what is sometimes called soft power, the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction rather than force. Ukraine's war effort has created huge amounts of its own soft power, as supporters rally online, post memes, crowdfund operations, and take to the streets. Meanwhile, the Russian invasion has had very little soft power from the start, with most of the world rejecting Putin's imperialist vision of the world. Political scientist Joseph Nye, who coined the term, described it as the simple fact that the best propaganda is not propaganda, and in the internet age, credibility is the scarcest resource. People around the world saw Putin's insane speeches and Russia's invasion begin on TV, computer and phone screens, and that's what has given Ukraine an edge in support for more than a year. This is yet another part of national will, as soft power influences whether a nation stands alone or with a coalition, and whether it can outlast its enemies. If soldiers on the battlefield feel that there are allies big and small behind them, there is also likely to be better morale and performance in the field. Putin does not have this type of soft power appeal, but knows that he can't continue to rule totally alone. Because of this, Every time he has tried to engage in psychological deep, close and rear operations, the results appear forced and unnatural. Years and years of Putin's brutal rule have left modern Russia as a place of staggering corruption and oppression, where daily life for millions is defined by fear and helplessness at the feet of a thankless government. It's very hard to build an effective society and military off of this model, especially when enough people see through the illusion created by those in power. This disconnect is obvious when we see Putin, who meets his advisors deep inside one of his personal fortresses and across the length of a huge table, suddenly appearing in Dagestan to greet crowds of seemingly adoring fans. Rather than showing unity, like Zelensky in Vilnius or at the book fair, Putin's actions come off as callous and fake. Why? Because anyone not neck-deep in Russian propaganda can see his obvious disregard and contempt for the lives of ordinary citizens. The illusion holds only through his iron fist and willingness to kill, torture, imprison, or exile anyone who might be a threat. And nothing is worse for real national will than a system glued together only by terror. When it fails, we start to see the cracks in a tyrant's rule. Christopher Bort, a scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has written a lot about this idea. In his view, one of the most enduring features of the Russian government is a willingness by its leaders to sacrifice ordinary people's lives for their personal goals. The ruler's needs have always come first, and Putin is just the latest in a long line of self-serving men in power. For instance, then US General Eisenhower was apparently in disbelief when Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov told him the standard method for clearing minefields during the Second World War was to send unknowing infantry troops across them as if the mines were not there. Putin's presidency and strategy in Ukraine show a similar lack of concern for human life. Bort points out the clear parallel that prior to Russia's invasion, for instance, the Kremlin's chain of command appears not to have told Russian soldiers that they were about to enter Ukraine to fight a real war. Afterward, the same chain of command neglected to claim those soldiers' bodies because acknowledging their deaths might embarrass the Kremlin. That probably doesn't surprise you by this point, which says something about how predictably horrible Putin's war strategy has become. And while we haven't yet seen the dam of Putin's support break yet, a broader analysis of the conflict shows that things can't last forever. Considering deep, close and rear operations in the way Nichols lays out gives us a picture of a Russia failing badly in many areas, not just on the battlefield. No country can fight forever if its national will for a conflict is exhausted, a lesson the West has learned the hard way. Nichols offers a reminder that during the post-9/11 war on terror, the United Kingdom outsourced many of its military operations in the Middle East to its defense ministry and contractors, with a lack of interest by the central government or public. The same can be said about the United States, which relied heavily on superior military power and outsourced much of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to private contractors. Eventually, conflict fatigue, loss of life and money, and the persistent harsh reality on the ground has led to both wars widely being considered as failures. Most recently, this led to the US military pullout from Afghanistan and Taliban re-takeover in 2020, capping 2 decades of unachieved national objectives. Things have already gone far worse for Putin in Ukraine than they did for the West in Iraq or Afghanistan, but he does not seem to have learned his lesson. And because of his autocratic rule, he also can't seem to get that when a country's psychological operations on the battlefield, the hearts and minds of citizens, and towards the international community are unified, it makes for a tough opponent. Ukraine has pulled this off, and achieved a level of unity by its military commanders, political leaders, and civil society that Putin never has and will never have. Ukraine is fighting this war with a common purpose, while most Russians are fighting it out of fear and for the whims of a powerful man. The good news is that a country like that can never win, not really. War is not just fought on the battlefield but also in the minds of soldiers and civilians, the halls of diplomatic summits, and the press of a book fair. The way countries win wars is by bringing the efforts of an entire society into alignment and preserving national will longer than the enemy. Putin can't do that. Instead, he largely sits alone in his fortress, trusting nobody and caring for nobody, unable to really bring most Russians or countries around the world onto his side. It's the inevitable crack in his armor, and that's why Russia's military can't outlast Ukraine's. Finally, it's also the reason why we shouldn't judge the success of Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive yet. So far, it has been far more about determining Russia's logistical and defense capabilities, harming enemy morale, and shoring up Ukraine's own geopolitical support from crucial allies. While there has been some increase in direct combat, it's nothing like we saw during the last fall counteroffensive. Basically, it looks like Zelensky and his top officials are playing a broader game this time around, potentially hoping to change the balance of power. So we shouldn't count Ukraine out now or anytime soon, especially since its unified national will is a clear long-term advantage. Whether this war lasts another year, 2 or more, Putin's Russia is not in a place that can hold on forever. But what do you think? Is Nichols right about how important national will is in today's conflicts? And will it let Ukraine outlast Russia? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. In the summer and autumn of 2022, Ukraine sent the Russian invaders reeling with its stunningly successful counteroffensives in the Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts. Over the course of a few months, Ukrainian soldiers liberated thousands of square kilometers of territory, essentially ended the Russian threat to the city of Kharkiv, and recaptured Kherson on the west bank of the Dnieper River, which was the only regional capital that Russia had captured after invading in February. With such victories behind it, Ukraine's Western allies eagerly anticipated the country's 2023 counteroffensive. Zaporizhzhia Oblast stood out as the likeliest axis of advance. A successful campaign there would break Russia's encirclement of the Sea of Azov and cut the land bridge to Crimea, trapping a sizable amount of the Russian forces behind Ukraine's lines, while preventing the illegally annexed peninsula from resupplying the rest of the Russian army overland. But unfortunately, the offensive has not gone as well as those seen in 2022. Russia clearly adapted to Ukraine's success from the earlier campaigns. However, Ukraine has adapted to Russia's new methods of conducting warfare too. How has each of the two sides adapted in the 2023 campaign? Let's take a look. As Russia ground to a halt around Bakhmut after it finally captured the city for the price of tens of thousands of casualties, Ukraine was preparing for its offensive into Zaporizhzhia. The Russians were preparing for it too, and constructed 3 lines of fortifications and trenches that proved to be the strongest seen in Europe since World War I. Russia also learned its lessons from the disasters it saw in 2022. It moved its command and control centers and other important assets further back from the front line to prevent HIMARS attacks. Russia was also paying attention to the news. It learned that Ukraine would be getting advanced Western main battle tanks like the German Leopard, British Challenger, and American Abrams. Knowing this, Russia assembled and trained special groups of tank hunters to destroy them. These tank hunters came armed with reconnaissance drones to spot the tanks. To kill them, at least some of the Russians would be armed with the 9M133 Kornet, which was introduced into the Russian military in 1998 and has an effective range of between 8 and 10 kilometers. In early September 2023, footage spread of a British Challenger tank destroyed as part of fighting around the village of Robotyne. The Kornet was the weapon responsible for this destruction. The Kornet fires a payload with a 10-pound warhead that can penetrate over 100 centimeters of armor from kilometers away. Ukraine also lost 6 Leopard tanks in the last days of October, on top of 6 destroyed earlier in the fighting. That number doesn't seem big at first glance, but only 71 of the Leopard tanks came into Ukraine. This means that about a fifth of the Ukrainian Leopards have been knocked out of commission. Russia has used a combination of mines, drones, and Kornet attacks to take out the Leopards. In an example of such tactics in action, 2 Leopards were struck near Olyansk, on the border between the Kharkiv and Luhansk oblasts. After a drone spotted the tanks, a nearby Kornet team fired. Germany has pledged to donate 14 more Leopards in 2024. Ukraine will need them. According to the Oryx blog, Ukraine has suffered 688 total tank losses throughout the war. Of these, 10 Leopard 2A4s have been destroyed or damaged. Another 10 Leopard 2A6 tanks have been destroyed, damaged, or abandoned. 3 Stridsvagn 122 tanks, a Swedish variant of the Leopard, have been abandoned after damage. 1 Challenger tank has been destroyed. Russia's preparation for the Western tanks meant that they were not as effective as hoped. Since Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in the summer, Russia has also used the seasonal vegetation to its advantage, concealing tanks and anti-tank units and ambushing Ukrainian forces. However, Ukraine also understood that its new Western tanks would become targets. To counter the tactics they expected Russia to use, the the Ukrainians kept their enemy guessing about where and when they would concentrate their new tanks. This in turn prevented Russia's tank hunters from concentrating as much as they could have. Ukraine lost relatively few of its Western-supplied tanks in the early months of the offensive. The heavier losses came at a time when Ukraine breached 2 of the 3 Russian defense lines in Zaporizhia. The Russian minefields have proven a serious obstacle to Ukrainian forces in Zaporizhia. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Ukraine is now the most heavily mined country in the world, and the minefields have gotten deeper since the start of the year. Russian minefields went from 120 to 500 meters deep. Once Ukraine started its offensive, Russia realized that its minefields were too shallow to deal with Western-supplied anti-mine equipment, like the M58 Miklik. The Miklik entered service with the United States Army and Marine Corps in 1988. It works by propelling a line charge that can clear ground in a lane of 100 meters long by 8 wide, allowing room for tanks to advance. The Miklik works against both single-pulse and pressure-fused mines. When the Russians saw the Ukrainians clearing their shallower minefields with the Miklik, they deepened them. This has come at a cost for the Russians, however, as it required them to break mines out of storage and deplete their stockpiles. Newer minefields are not as formidable. Additionally, Russia has lacked anti-vehicle landmines, and the mines it has at its disposal have not proven particularly effective against Western vehicles, which are manufactured to be resistant to them. However, Russia adapted to this reality by stacking landmines together or pairing them with improvised explosive devices. Although this tactic has helped to stall Ukraine's advance, it's also accelerated the depletion of Russia's stockpile of landmines. Now, with Ukrainian units moving past the first 2 lines of Russian defenses, it may have been a tactic that backfired for the long haul. Both sides have adapted the way they use artillery throughout this campaign. Ukrainian gunners have often waited for their Russian enemies to fire first. While this has deprived Ukraine's frontline units of fire support, it's also given Ukrainian gunners the chance to fire back at the Russian artillery. Using Western-supplied counter-battery radars, Ukrainian gunners were able to land precision shots on the Russian batteries, depriving enemy infantry and armor units of artillery support. Russia's army is primarily an artillery one, and the damage to its artillery units opened new opportunities for Ukraine to advance, as the Russian positions became weakened thanks to the lack of such artillery. One of Russia's early adaptations to slow Ukrainian advances was to set fixed positions that can deliver artillery fire into its own trenches. Presumably, this would come only after friendly forces had retreated from those positions, but given that incompetence has proven a calling card in the Russian way of war, it's difficult to know for certain. Russian casualties have been heavier in the Zaporizhia campaign than Ukrainian casualties have, which is pretty remarkable considering that Russia has been the defender there and had the benefit of its extensive fortifications. It also shows the effectiveness of the Western equipment Ukraine has been receiving, since the armored vehicles are specifically designed to prevent personnel losses. As Ukraine started to make more headwinds in late September around Robotyne and Verbov, Russian casualties spiked further. If Russia were to prioritize firing into its own trenches at specific points from fixed places to slow the advancing Ukrainians down, it would be accurate with the broader picture of how it has needed to adapt its artillery doctrine. However, the Russians' tactic of firing into their own trenches did not last for long. As we mentioned, Ukrainian forces adapted to this by holding their artillery units in reserve and waiting until the Russian firepower was unleashed. The Western-supplied counter-battery radars and precision strikes took a toll on the fixed Russian guns. The Ukrainian forces proved so effective at this tactics that complaints on Russian social media about it began to spread. One of Russia's generals in Zaporizhia, Ivan Popov, was fired after complaining in public about the effectiveness of Ukraine's counter-battery fire. In a leaked audio recording, Popov alleged that Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of the general staff, fainted after hearing the unvarnished truth. In a message to an unidentified subordinate, Popov said, "I f***ed Gerasimov up so bad that the bastard fainted. It was a straightforward conversation." This was hardly the first time that Gerasimov faced discontent from his subordinates. He was a frequent target of the Wagner Group's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who mutinied and demanded his removal at the end of June. Prigozhin was killed in a convenient plane accident on August 23rd, but it seems the criticism of Russia's top general has survived the infamous Wagner man's death. Now, instead of shelling their trenches, Russian forces have taken to using demolition charges to blow them up when Ukrainian forces are advancing through them. Although this has not inflicted casualties as heavy as the usage of artillery would, it has nevertheless slowed the Ukrainians down and denied them the use of strong defensive positions. Both sides have adapted their use of artillery to deal with a shortage of ammunition. The shortage has meant that Russia has been less able to use the mass World War II-style artillery barrages it otherwise prefers. Russia has reached rates of firing 30,000 shells per day in Ukraine and peaked at a rate of 60,000. But that has proven an unsustainable level of ammunition depletion. Putin's meeting with Kim Jong-un in September made waves, as the North Korean dictator agreed to supply his counterpart with the artillery shells he has badly needed. South Korea's National Intelligence Service estimates that the North Koreans have already sent 1 million shells to Russia in 10 separate shipments. Further, the North Koreans are making more of them. According to Yoo Sang-bum, a member of South Korea's Parliamentary Intelligence Committee, the North's factories are running at maximum capacity to help supply Russia's demand for ammunition. Even with the help, the high ammunition demands of the war have forced Russia to adapt and try to be more precise with its firepower in order to preserve ammunition and keep its weapons in working order. The high rate of artillery fire not only depletes ammunition, but overheats the guns and makes it easier to be targeted by counter-battery fire. Britain's Royal United Services RUSI think tank reported in September that Russia's gunners have attempted to maximize the accuracy of their weapons with reduced ammunition expenditure rather than resorting to saturation fire. Russia continues to rely on imprecise MLRS systems and 120mm mortars, but it has also grown more sophisticated. For example, it has prioritized the manufacture of Krasnopol 152mm laser-guided artillery shells. Russia has used these shells in conjunction with drone surveillance to get better coordinates for its artillery fire. These adaptations have created a more effective Russian artillery force that has helped to slow Ukraine's counteroffensive in Zaporizhia. Russia has also made progress on its communications effectiveness. Russian signal security has proven poor throughout the war, which made its plans easy to discover and its important infrastructure easy to target with precision HIMARS strikes. The Russians were often forced to use civilian systems to communicate. Now, however, the Russian military is relying more on app-based services to access and encode data. The new systems can provide a 3G connection to multiple devices, and although the experts at RUSI doubt the security of this approach, they admit that it reduces the communications burden on Russian forces, allowing them to more easily systematize their methods and improve their fire coordination. The new communication systems and Russia's growing usage of drones in number and diversity to coordinate with the Krasnopol systems were particularly concerning to the staff at RUSI. The Ukrainian forces have experienced the same problem of shell depletion and artillery barrel overheating. Even though they typically fire far fewer shells than their Russian enemies, Ukraine has 17 different artillery systems in operation, and even though it is well supplied by its Western allies, it cannot expect replacement barrels for all of these weapons if overheating occurs. As a result, Ukraine typically only fires its guns for 2 to 15-minute sessions. The missions on both sides have not been as grand in 2023 as they were in 2022. Company-level assaults have been the dominant form of combat in this campaign. Ukraine's choice to engage in constant low-level operations across its entire front line, stretching from Kherson in the south and west to the Russian border in the north and east, has necessitated that each individual operation be smaller. Ukraine's Western allies originally opposed this type of organization. They instead wanted to see a more concentrated drive along one or two axes. Nevertheless, the choice is played to Ukraine's strengths, as it does not give the Russians as many opportunities to use their superior air and firepower. It's also prevented the Russians from conducting offensive activities of their own or concentrating to reinforce the already formidable defenses in Zaporizhia. Only in the autumn did Russia resume offensive operations, with its advance towards Avdiivka. Communications and staffing issues have additionally prevented both sides from concentrating as much force as required. As we noted, Russia's communication issues have proven a big problem throughout the war, and Ukraine has had a lack of professional staff officers to coordinate the movements of the huge army it has built since the start of the war. The change in operational tempo has been satisfactory for the Russians, as they shifted to an attrition strategy once it became clear that their army would not prevail in a decisive campaign. This is the traditional Russian way of war, and it's been seen in new ways during the 2023 campaign. For example, Russia will often forward deploy a few tanks, As Ukrainian units get bogged down in minefields or terrain features, the Russian tanks will engage and destroy Ukrainian units before they in turn get knocked out. For example, early in the morning of June 4th, Ukrainian units were traversing ground that had been mined but had been cleared in a width of 6 meters before the advance. 2 tanks and several infantry vehicles moved forward, but slowly, and the ground was boggy. Russian tanks were waiting for them, and at this point unmasked themselves. The Russian tanks were eventually destroyed, but only after inflicting disproportionate casualties on their Ukrainian enemies, which were now fully committed to the breach and could not withdraw easily. Tactics like this take advantage of Russia's biggest asset, sheer numbers. The sacrifice of the tanks was cynical and something that Western officers would avoid doing, but Russia has the world's largest tank force, even though most of these tanks are far from top of the line. Because it has such a vast stockpile of tanks, it can afford to sacrifice them if it means disproportionate casualties on Ukrainian vehicles and personnel that will be harder for its enemy to replace. However, for the Russians, there is also a problem with this strategy. Many of the Western vehicles they have managed to remove from the battlefield were not destroyed outright. Rather, they were damaged and later repaired. Tank kills have increased in recent months, and the Ukrainians have steadily broken through Russian defenses and have been able to move more. But through 2023 as a whole, many Western tanks have only been damaged by mines rather than destroyed by Cornet rounds or Russia's new emphasis on laser-guided artillery. The result is that a lot of the Western tanks that have been damaged have simply been shifted to the rear or even to Poland for repairs. They are then sent back into action. This dynamic plays out not just in armor, but with personnel too. The Western vehicles have protected Ukrainian crews from dying, while Russian soldiers have not had that benefit. Russia's willingness to sacrifice its soldiers is one of the reasons why it has taken more casualties despite being on the defensive. Just as importantly, the survival of Ukrainian soldiers has allowed Kyiv to build an army increasingly composed of veterans with valuable combat experience, while Russia's soldiers continually get put into a meat grinder that kills off troops who have seen combat. This is not as important as Russia maintains a defensive posture within its fortifications, but the lack of experienced combat troops puts its success in significant doubt with regards to other operations. The less than stellar performance in its autumn offensive toward Avdiivka shows that. In the Avdiivka offensive, Russia has so far lost as many vehicles in 3 weeks as Ukraine lost during the entire Battle of Zaporizhia this year. Russia has made progress at Avdiivka and surrounded a pocket of Ukrainian defenders, but at the price of 197 damaged or destroyed vehicles, according to the Institute for the Study of War. Russia suffered 99 vehicle losses between October 9th and 13th in its first assault wave. An additional 94 vehicles were damaged or destroyed between the 14th and 23rd of October. The toll taken on the infantry has proven even worse. Just as in Bakhmut, Russia has sent wave after wave of mostly inexperienced and poorly equipped troops into the teeth of Ukrainian defenses around Avdiivka. On October 25th, Oleksandr Shutpun, a spokesman for Ukrainian southern forces, alleged that Russia suffered 2,500 dead and wounded men in 6 days of fighting. The human wave attacks consist of small infantry units amounting to 30 or 40 men each. Before February 24, 2022, Russia claimed that it was a modern combined arms fighting force, with state-of-the-art equipment and tactics. However, it has prosecuted the war in ways that have proven little different from the way it has fought its conflicts for centuries, where it's called upon its seemingly inexhaustible reserve of manpower to batter the enemy into submission. With this in mind, the war in Ukraine looks less like a modern war and more like Russia's depressing experience in the Winter War in Finland, where it suffered a casualty ratio as high as 10-1. Russia's ruthless strategy and willingness to take more punishment than its enemy may be crude, but poses significant problems for Ukraine. To counter Russia's tactics, Ukraine will need to have a steady stream of well-trained, high-quality veteran troops arriving on the battlefield. NATO's training of Ukrainian troops should have theoretically helped with this. However, the way NATO conducted its training has been the subject of controversy in Ukraine. As the progress of the campaign in Zaporizhia proved much slower than the West hoped for, the Ukrainian military became subject to criticism. For example, a leaked German military document from July revealed that Bundeswehr officers critiqued Ukrainian forces for not implementing NATO training properly and for splitting Western-trained brigades into small units of 10 to 30 soldiers, while attacking enemy positions. Ukrainian units, though, have in turn critiqued NATO, accusing the alliance of training them for the wrong kind of war. American officers in Ukraine have echoed this sentiment, saying that NATO has dusted off its counterinsurgency warfare doctrine and taught it to Ukrainian troops. Ukrainian troops have also complained about a lack of training on drone and mine awareness, explosive ordnance disposal, and combat in defense, which contributed to their getting bogged down in minefields. Other soldiers have said that the training did not last long enough, at times only coming in 3-week intervals. NATO trainers also seem to lack knowledge of the terrain and the necessity of small units to fight through thick tree lines. Finally, NATO trainers have tended to focus too much on individual soldiers' skills and neglect training in units of companies or greater. One of the last but more important reasons Ukraine's offensive has lacked the pace of last year's campaigns is that Russian forces have learned to retreat in a more orderly way. In Kharkiv and Kherson, Russian units retreated in routes, amplifying casualties and the territory liberated. In Zaporizhia, retreats have been orderly, leaving fewer opportunities for Ukraine to exploit. With winter fast approaching, it appears that major action will take a lull for the time being, but with Western fighter jets like the F-16 set to arrive, keep on the lookout for newer adaptations as the war drags on into a third year. But what adaptations do you think have proven important to the pace of the Zaporizhia campaign? What changes have both sides made and why do they matter? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The Navy, along with aviation, are the branches of the military in which Russia had an incredible advantage before the start of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and until now, but it's useless. Why is the country with the third strongest navy losing a water war to Ukraine? The last attacks on Crimea and Russian Navy bases proved once more that Russian Navy superiority makes no sense on the battlefield. In this video, we will explain why. Let's start with the numbers. Prior to the invasion, the Russian naval forces had a total of 266 active units in their inventory. The Russian Navy placed a strong emphasis on safeguarding its coastline and conducting underwater operations, with a significant allocation of resources to corvettes, comprising 31.2% with 83 units, submarines, constituting 21.8% with 58 units, and mine-countermine warfare, making up 18%, with 48 units. The remainder of the fleet exhibited a relatively even distribution, encompassing categories such as aircraft carriers 1 unit, cruisers and battle cruisers 5 units, destroyers 12 units, frigates 11 units, offshore patrol vessels 27 units, and amphibious assault support ships 21 units. The majority of Russian vessels were considered outdated and had been inherited from the USSR. The most prominent examples are the aircraft carrier Kuznetsov, which was 32 years old, the cruiser Moskva, which was 39, and the destroyer Vadim Kulikov, which was 40. As of February 24th, the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet comprised a total of 275 ships and vessels, with just 58 of them classified as combat ships. When considering patrol boats alongside combat vessels, the Black Sea Fleet's combined combat-capable units numbered 74 by February 2022. In the months leading up to the full-scale invasion, Russia systematically removed almost any naval assets that could potentially be used for a seaborne invasion. A total of 46 warships were redeployed from all of the Russian Federation's fleets to the Black and Azov Seas. Under the pretext of conducting large-scale exercises, the Kremlin effectively established a naval blockade along the Black Sea coastline of Ukraine from February 13th to 19th, 2022. The Mediterranean Sea also witnessed an unprecedented presence of Russian troops, consisting of 17 warships from all 4 Russian Federation fleets, including 2 missile cruisers, as well as an additional 7 missile ships of various types, including 2 missile submarines. But how have Russia's naval moves changed Ukraine's navy? During the initial phase of the Russian-Ukraine war and the occupation of Crimea in 2014, Russian forces seized 51 Ukrainian ships, accounting for 85% of the Ukrainian Navy fleet. Imagine how bad that was. By 2022, the Ukrainian Navy's active naval inventory consisted of only 15 units. The contemporary Ukrainian Navy heavily relied on its patrol force. The service faced significant deficiencies across various categories and domains, primarily comprising aging vessel ships in critical areas essential for naval effectiveness. For instance, their lone frigate, the Sahaydachny, is approaching 3 decades in service, while their single mine or countermine vessel has exceeded 35 years of service. Apart from a couple of landing craft, which have also significantly surpassed their intended service life, the service possesses a limited collection of offshore patrol vessels, OPVs. Among these OPVs, the youngest hulls are no more than 5 years old, while the oldest ones date back 4 decades. Okay, so Ukraine's fleet experienced significant losses right from the start. But what exactly happened? At the outset of the invasion, Russian warships were relocated to the Odessa area. Subsequently, Russian forces managed to seize control of Snake Island, Serpent Island or Zminy Island, a small yet strategically significant island southwest of Odessa. The valiant defense of the island by Ukrainian forces, along with the defiant phrase, "Russian warship, go F yourself," played a crucial role in bolstering the morale of Ukrainians who had endured heavy losses over an extended period. On March 3, 2022, Ukraine deliberately sank its frigate, the Sahaydachny, as it had encountered the ravages of war near the wells of a factory in Mykolaiv and was deemed unfit for further service. On the same day, another setback occurred for the Ukrainian fleet when the Ukrainian patrol vessel Slovyansk was sunk by a Russian Federation aircraft, struck by a Kh-31 missile. In early March, the patrol ship Korets and riverboat BK-02 Ackerman and BK-06 Visherod were also captured in Berdyansk. Likewise, in early March, BK-04 Kremenchuk and BK-05 Lubny were seized in Mariupol. The small reconnaissance ship A512 Pereyaslav likely sustained damage on the Dnipro River in late March 2022. The amphibious assault boat Stanislav was lost during a Ukrainian counterattack on the Zminy Island on May 7, 2022. The island was deoccupied at the beginning of July. Subsequently, in July 2022, the raid minesweeper Henichesk was sunk in a missile attack carried out by Russian aircraft. Another boat was hit on November 4, 2022. From that time until today, several other ships were also damaged. As a conclusion, the small Ukrainian fleet suffered huge losses. But it didn't give up at all. In spite of these achievements and the blockade of Ukrainian ports, the aggressor eventually faced consequences for their invasion. As of October 1, 2023, a total of 20 Russian ships and boats, along with 1 submarine, have been destroyed, marking 2 significant turning points on March 24 and April 14, 2022, that forever altered perceptions of the invincibility of the Russian fleet. On March 24, 2022, substantial damage was inflicted on the large amphibious ships Novocherkassk and Sezakunikov, while the large amphibious assault ship Saratov was completely destroyed. This incident resulted in numerous casualties and injuries among personnel, as well as damage to military equipment that had been transported by these ships to the occupied port of Berdyansk. Saratov came under attack from Ukrainian Tochka-U missiles, a Soviet tactical missile system originally designed for ground targets and not previously employed against ships. What a surprise! On the night of April 13th to April 14th, which was 21 days after the attack on the large amphibious ships in Berdyansk, the flagship of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet, the Guard missile cruiser Moskva, came under attack. Let's delve into this particular incident in greater detail. So here's what happened. The ship met its demise when it was targeted by 2 Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles. The inaugural Neptune system, mounted on a new Tatra chassis, was assembled in August 2021 in preparation for Ukraine's 30th Independence Day parade. However, the first batch of missiles ordered by the state for the military didn't reach Odessa until February 20, 2022. Initial missile launches occurred promptly, prior to February 26, when 3 Russian amphibious ships departed from ports in Crimea and steered towards the Ukrainian coast in the Mykolaiv region. The Russians managed to intercept and neutralize all 3 missiles, but the realization that Ukraine possessed this missile capability prompted the ships to hastily return to Crimea. This development surprised the Russians since the Neptune missiles weren't scheduled to be in the armed forces' arsenal by late February. Following the failed launch, doubts arose regarding the missile's quality. In mid-March, experts from Kyiv conducted an inspection and discovered that all the missiles shared a single component failure, which had prevented them from detonating as intended. This issue was promptly rectified, and the Neptune missiles awaited an opportune moment for testing, which unexpectedly came on April 13th. You can't even imagine how lucky the Ukrainians were. Conventional radar indicated the presence of a significant target roughly 120 kilometers from the coast. In this sector of the Black Sea, only one object matched the size: the flagship of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva. Due to dense clouds over the sea, the radar signal bounced off the clouds onto the water's surface and back to the clouds. The Russians were so confident in their invulnerability to Ukrainian forces that they likely hadn't even activated their air defense systems. Even if they had, the Neptune missiles would have posed formidable challenges for them. The Neptune is a slow-moving, liquid-fueled missile that approaches its target unnoticed until the very last moment, making it almost invisible to standard air defense systems as it skims over the water. It boasts a maximum flight range of up to 300 kilometers and a speed of 900 kilometers an hour, with a missile length of 5,050 millimeters and a launch weight of around 870 kilograms, including a 150-kilogram combat warhead. These specifications are more than sufficient for disabling combat surface ships and transport vessels weighing up to 5,000 tons. The missile is equipped with a cross-shaped folding wing, and its warhead is activated either upon target contact or remotely via non-contact sensors. The vacuum-packed warhead significantly enhances the explosive effect. The missile's homing warhead boasts ultra-wide viewing angles of plus 60 degrees, can identify and lock onto a target from a distance of 50 kilometers, and is highly resistant to enemy radar jamming. By comparison, the American Harpoon anti-ship missile has less robust characteristics, with viewing angles of plus 45 degrees. Thanks to the effective deployment of these two missiles, the missile cruiser Moskva was sunk. Following these events, Russia's diminishing capabilities became evident. The loss of the Moskva marked the most significant military setback for Russia in the war with Ukraine, given its residual value of $750 million. Beyond the financial and reputational losses, the Russian fleet also suffered strategic and tactical setbacks. After the sinking of the Moskva, which served as the air defense umbrella, 5 to 6 Russian ships in the Black Sea withdrew from the Ukrainian coast. Imagine how they felt. In early May 2022, Russia attempted to fortify the vulnerable garrison stationed on the captured Ukrainian island of Zmyny. However, after the loss of the Moskva and the retreat of the Russian fleet to Crimea, protecting Russian supply ships in the western part of the Black Sea became increasingly challenging. This vessel symbolized Russia's Black Sea fleet and was among the best in its class, boasting an impressive tonnage-to-armament ratio. Its primary mission involved engaging carrier groups, frigates, and cruisers using 16 Vulcan cruise missiles. The ship featured a Fort, or S-300 air defense system battery, torpedoes, and helicopters. The Moskva played a pivotal role in establishing an air defense umbrella through air target detection radar stations and missile systems. Other Russian ships in the naval group relied on the flagship's cover, as they lacked robust means of detecting and destroying targets. The absence of the cruiser at sea soon had significant repercussions. On May 2nd, 2 Russian patrol boats of Project 03160, Raptor, and the landing ship of Project 11770, Cerna, were struck by TB-2 Bayraktar drones near Snake Island. On May 5th, a Russian frigate of Project 11356R type Petrel caught fire near the Ukrainian island of Zmyny in the Black Sea, presumably after being hit by a Neptune missile. On May 7th, near Zmyny Island in the Black Sea, Ukrainian defenders destroyed a Russian Cerna-type boat. On June 17th, in the vicinity of the island, the Ukrainian Navy launched 2 Harpoon missiles, targeting the tugboat Lifeguard Vasil Bek. Although it was not sunk, the ship had to be towed to Sevastopol. Isolated from supplies and unable to sustain its defense of the island, the Russian garrison evacuated Zmyny on June 30th. With the loss of cruiser Moskva, along with its long-range missiles and the relinquishing of control over Zmyny Island, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's ability to deploy significant Russian amphibious forces and protect them against air and missile attacks was compromised. This means what? That Russia can no longer establish a coastal front along the western Ukrainian coast for an assault on the port of Odessa, which remains Ukraine's primary strategic maritime outlet. Prior to the effective use of anti-ship systems like Neptune and Harpoon, Russian ships would approach the coast from a distance of 18 to 25 miles and unleash artillery fire with impunity. The introduction of these weapons significantly altered Russia's tactics, as ships started to maintain a closer proximity to the Crimean Peninsula, avoiding any approach within 100 kilometers of the coastline under Ukrainian control. Both missile systems have an estimated range of approximately 174 miles when fired from the shore, covering nearly the entire northwestern portion of the Black Sea, but falling short of reaching the Russian Navy's base in Sevastopol. Following the acquisition of Grim 2 missiles by the Ukrainian armed forces, capable of covering a distance of 310 miles on a quasi-ballistic trajectory, and 2 naval drone attacks on the main base in Sevastopol, Russian missile carriers now venture to sea only when accompanied by boats, taking refuge near the southern coast of Crimea. Speaking of naval drones, they've been an absolute game-changer, altering not only the course of the Russo-Ukraine conflict, but also the landscape of modern warfare itself, and it is primarily Ukraine that deserves the credit for this monumental development. Naval drones have emerged as a notable innovation in this war. In the Black Sea, Ukraine has ushered in a new era of naval warfare with the use of suicide sea drones, armed with explosives designed to ram into targets and detonate upon impact. Scott Savitz, a senior analyst at the RAND Corporation, commented that Ukraine has employed these explosive uncrewed surface vessels, USVs, as formidable weapons against Russian fleets and even infrastructure. Savitz's analysis highlights that seafaring drones possess a unique capability to carry substantial explosive payloads and strike at the waterline of ships, rendering them more dangerous than aerial weapons like missiles and bombs. Furthermore, their relatively low cost allows Ukraine to execute attacks with a large number of drones, making them difficult to detect by Russian warships despite their scale. Ukraine initially employed sea drones in a significant attack in October 2022, targeting Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. Following this, Ukraine developed more sophisticated drones capable of carrying larger explosive payloads. In recent months, Ukrainian sea drones have successfully targeted a Russian warship near a naval port and a Russian oil tanker. Each drone costs only about $250,000, yet it has the potential to inflict damage on or destroy multi-million-dollar Russian vessels. As these drones are relatively new, they are compelling Russia to develop advanced defenses against them. How can Russia respond to such innovation? It needs to allocate additional resources to protect its ships, ports, and bridges, safeguarding its economy and troop resupply capability. These sea drones exemplify Ukraine's ingenuity in outsmarting a more powerful and better armed adversary. Throughout history, wars have often spurred innovations in naval technology. The American Civil War witnessed the debut of ironclad warships, while World War I introduced widespread submarine warfare. World War II demonstrated the superiority of aircraft carriers over battleships. The Russian-Ukrainian war showed how good the naval drones were. However, drones are better suited for attacking stationary targets such as ports, ships at anchor, and hydraulic structures. Targeting fast and maneuverable ships presents greater challenges, requiring constant location updates, and although 154 pounds of explosives might damage a corvette or frigate, it's unlikely to destroy them. So Ukraine started to develop more advanced drones. Civilian vessels loaded with military equipment make more effective targets, as they are slower and typically follow predictable routes. Instances of attacks on warships in the open sea have also been reported. You can't even imagine what a success that was. In May 2023, drones struck the Russian reconnaissance ship Ivan Kurs. On the night of July 25th, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported an attempted attack on the patrol ship Sergei Kotov, which was believed to have been dispatched by the Russians to intercept civilian vessels. Some drones have the range to project force across the entire Black Sea. In November, they targeted the oil terminal at Novorossiysk, which was only 546 yards from the submarine parking area, as noted by naval expert Volodymyr Zablotsky of Defense Express. He emphasized that the Black Sea lacks safe havens for the enemy. Currently, Ukraine is developing and using various models of maritime drones. We'll tell you about some of them. The new underwater drone Marichka, which passes the first tests. The drone is designed to attack surface and underwater targets, bridges, and coastal fortifications. If necessary, an unmanned ship can transport cargo, for which it is equipped with several compartments, or engage in reconnaissance. Length 6.56 yards, width 1.09 yards, range 621 miles, price about $400,000. Another drone is the Magura V5 surface drone. Length 6 yards, width 1.64 yards, height above the waterline 0.54 yards, cruising speed 22 knots, 25.28 miles per hour, maximum speed 42 knots, 48.5 miles an hour, range 517.6 miles, and payload 705 pounds. Magura V5 is controlled via satellite or radio. The marine drone is equipped with a video camera and broadcasts video from it online. The drone is multifunctional. In addition to hitting targets, it can carry out reconnaissance, surveillance, patrolling, security, and demining. Controlling a drone does not require a complex infrastructure. Only a control panel comparable in size to a laptop is required. In addition to the operator, the device is serviced by several other people. Despite the considerable weight, no special construction is required to launch the drone on the water. A special feature of Magura V5 is the ability to work in a swarm of 3 drones. At the same time, the main one of them has hardware differences. Probably the additional equipment is a signal repeater. The Sea Baby drone is assembled underground at the factory in Ukraine. Payload 992 to 1,874 pounds. Range at least 435 miles. In addition to the Crimean bridge, the drones successfully destroyed the large amphibious ship Olenogorsky Gornyak and the Russian tanker Sig. Naval drones allow you to effectively disable enemy ships and other targets in and near the water. The armed forces proved effective in sea battles despite the actual absence of a fleet. There are a few enemy ships compared to other types of equipment, so disabling each one is a great achievement. The Russians destroy up to 70% of naval drones, but the remaining 30% cause them significant problems. You know they'll cause it. The cost of the drone and the ship is incomparable. The creation of a separate brigade of naval drones indicates a large number of them are in service. First in world history, Ukraine creates a fleet of maritime drones, which has already compelled the Russians to conceal their ships. President Volodymyr Zelensky announced this development at the International Forum of Defense Industries on September 30, 2023. Currently, there are 134 types of maritime drones worldwide, but most are reconnaissance or training models. Ukrainian drones stand out for their pioneering effectiveness in actual combat operations at sea as a component of full-scale warfare. Although Ukraine's pioneering use of sea drones may not necessarily shift the tide of war, it could have a similar transformative effect. Ukraine's attack on Sevastopol marked the world's first instance of combining sea and aerial drones in warfare. They were also successfully combined with long-range missiles. Drones are a key component of the Ukrainian Mosquito fleet concept. This is the concept that fast and maneuverable warships can deal significant damage to larger enemy ships, thereby being more effective. Currently, naval drones can serve at least 3 roles: demining the coastal zone, conducting maritime reconnaissance, particularly near Crimea, and executing force projection and strike missions. Ultimately, we can say that long-range anti-ship missiles and naval drones force the Russian fleet to retreat as far as possible to those safe zones that still remain. Currently, Ukraine is working on destroying Russian air defense systems, ships near Crimea, and headquarters. Due to the latest tactics, the entire potential of the Russian fleet is being destroyed. Do you think an effective weapon against naval drones will be invented? Or is that an end to the Navy? What do you think will be the water war in the future? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.